Lyonesse, a name whispered across the centuries like the sound of waves breaking upon ancient stone. A kingdom of fertile fields, prosperous towns, and 140 churches, stretching far beyond the granite cliffs of Cornwall into the open Atlantic. A land of knights and lords, of farmers and fishermen, of ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that one terrible night ceased to exist. The sea rose, the storms came, and an entire civilization vanished beneath the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind nothing but scattered islands, half-remembered stories, and the eternal, haunting question, was Lyonesse real? This is the story of one of the most compelling lost lands in all of human history. It is a story that weaves together Arthurian legend and geological science, medieval romance and modern archaeology, ancient folklore and cutting-edge technology. It is the story of a place that exists in the borderland between myth and reality, between the world we can see and the world that lies just beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. It is the story of Lyonesse. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Chapter 1. The Legend Awakens. To understand Lyonesse, one must first stand upon the westernmost tip of Cornwall, at a place called Land's End. It is a dramatic headland, a jagged thrust of ancient granite rising from the churning Atlantic, battered by winds that have traveled thousands of miles across open ocean. Stand here on a clear day and look westward, out past the crashing surf, past the wheeling seabirds, past the line where sky meets water, and you will see, some 28 miles distant, a scattering of small islands rising from the sea. These are the Isles of Scilly, a tiny archipelago of around 140 islands, islets, and rocky outcrops, of which only 5 are currently inhabited. Today, the stretch of water between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly is open ocean, a treacherous passage of currents, reefs, and unpredictable weather that has claimed countless ships over the centuries. But according to legend, this was not always the case. According to a tradition that stretches back at least 1,000 years, this stretch of sea was once dry land. It was a country, a kingdom, a place where people lived and worked and built their homes and raised their families. It was Lyonesse. The legend tells us that Lyonesse was a prosperous and beautiful land, a country of rolling green fields, dense forests, and thriving communities. Some versions of the story speak of 140 churches scattered across its landscape, serving a population that must have numbered in the tens of thousands. It was a land connected to Cornwall, extending the peninsula far out into the Atlantic, with the Isles of Scilly forming its westernmost hills and high ground. And then in a single catastrophic event, some accounts say in a single night, the sea overwhelmed it all. The waters rose with terrifying speed, flooding the low-lying fields, swallowing the villages, drowning the churches. The people fled in panic, but for most there was no escape. The sea was too fast, too powerful, too relentless. Lyonesse sank beneath the waves, and an entire kingdom was erased from the physical world, surviving only in the memories and stories of those who escaped. This is the core of the Lyonesse legend, and it is a story that has captivated the human imagination for centuries. But it is also a story that raises profound questions. Is it merely a fairy tale, a piece of romantic fiction conjured by medieval storytellers to add color and drama to the Arthurian legends? Or does it preserve, in its mythic language, a genuine memory of real geological events that transformed the landscape of southwestern Britain in the centuries after the last ice age? The answer, as we shall discover, is far more complex and far more fascinating than a simple yes or number. Chapter 2. The Arthurian connection. The name Lyonesse is inseparable from the legends of King Arthur, that great mythic cycle of stories that has shaped the literature and culture of the English-speaking world for over 1,000 years. To understand how Lyonesse fits into this grand narrative, we must trace its literary history, beginning with the earliest references and following the story as it evolved through centuries of retelling. The Arthurian legends, in their fullest form, describe a world of chivalry, magic, and tragedy, centered on the court of King Arthur at Camelot. Arthur, the once and future king, rules over a Britain beset by enemies and internal strife, surrounded by his knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Galahad, and many others. Each of these knights has his own story, his own adventures, his own triumphs and failures. And among the most famous of these knights is Sir Tristan, also known as Tristram, whose tragic love affair with Iseult, also called Isolde, is one of the great love stories of Western literature. It is through Tristan that Lyonesse enters the Arthurian world. In the medieval romances, Tristan is described as the son of Meliodas, king of Lyonesse, and his queen, Elizabeth. The story of Tristan's birth is itself steeped in tragedy. His mother died giving birth to him, and it was from this sorrowful beginning that he received his name Tristan, from the French word triste, meaning sad. Orphaned and exiled, Tristan grew to become one of the greatest knights of Arthur's court, but his story would always be shadowed by loss and longing. In the romances of the 12th and 13th centuries, Lyonesse is presented as a real place, a kingdom with its own geography, its own political structures, its own history. It is not described as a lost land or a sunken kingdom in these early texts. Rather, it appears as a functioning part of the Arthurian world, a territory that exists alongside Cornwall, Logres, and the other kingdoms of Arthur's Britain. The French poet Beryl, writing in the late 12th century, composed one of the earliest surviving versions of the Tristan legend, though his version does not make extensive use of the Lyonesse setting. It was Thomas of Britain, another 12th century poet, who gave the story a more elaborate geographical framework, placing Tristan's origins in a specific kingdom that later writers would identify with Lyonesse. But it was in the great prose romances of the 13th century, particularly the vast cycle of interconnected stories known as the Vulgate cycle or the Lancelot Grail cycle, that Lyonesse became firmly established as part of the Arthurian landscape. In these texts, Lyonesse is described as a significant kingdom, a land of importance in the political geography of Arthur's Britain. It is a place where knights ride on quests, where tournaments are held, where the complex web of feudal loyalties and rivalries that drives the Arthurian story plays out against a backdrop of castles, forests, and open countryside. The name itself has gone through many variations over the centuries. In the French romances, it appears as Lyonnois or Lyonnais. In some versions, it is Lonois or Lyonnais. The English form Lyonesse emerged gradually, shaped by centuries of translation and adaptation. Some scholars have argued that the original Lyonnois referred not to a lost land off Cornwall, but to the region of Laon in Brittany, the great Celtic peninsula of northwestern France that has deep historical and cultural connections to Cornwall. Others have suggested a link to Lothian in Scotland, pointing out the phonetic similarities between Lyonnois and Lothian. This scholarly debate over the original location of Lyonesse is significant because it highlights a fundamental challenge in studying Arthurian geography. The Arthurian legends were not composed by a single author in a single time and place. They evolved over centuries, drawing on Celtic mythology, French courtly romance, Welsh bardic tradition, and English chronicle history. As the stories were told and retold, translated and adapted, the geographical references shifted and changed, reflecting the knowledge and interests of each new storyteller. What is clear, however, is that by the late medieval period, Lyonesse had become firmly associated with Cornwall and with the idea of a drowned land off the Cornish coast. This association was reinforced by the physical geography of the region, the dramatic coastline, the treacherous waters, the distant Isles of Scilly, and by the rich tradition of local folklore that spoke of a lost land beneath the sea. Sir Thomas Malory, the 15th century English knight whose great work, Le Morte d'Arthur, became the definitive English version of the Arthurian legends, used the name Lyonesse extensively. In Malory's telling, Lyonesse is Tristan's homeland, the kingdom of his father, and a place of significance in the broader Arthurian world. Malory does not describe Lyonesse as a sunken land. In his story, it is simply a kingdom, as real and present as any other. but by Mallory's time, the identification of literary Lyonesse with the legendary drowned land off Cornwall was well established in popular tradition, and this identification would only grow stronger in the centuries that followed. It is worth pausing here to consider what the Arthurian legends meant to medieval audiences. For modern readers, these stories are clearly understood as fiction, magnificent, enduring fiction, but fiction nonetheless. For medieval audiences, the distinction between history and legend was far less clear. The Arthurian stories were understood by many to be essentially historical, a record of real events that had taken place in Britain's distant past. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written in the 1130s, presented Arthur as a historical king of Britain and was accepted as genuine history by many readers for centuries. In this context, Lyonesse was not understood as a mythical place, but as a real kingdom that had existed in the past, and the story of its drowning was understood not as fantasy, but as a record of a real catastrophe. This blending of history and legend, of fact and fiction, is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Lyonesse tradition. It is not simply a literary invention imposed upon a landscape. Rather, it is a complex interweaving of literary tradition, local folklore, physical geography, and genuine geological history, and untangling these threads is one of the great challenges and great pleasures of studying this remarkable lost land. Chapter 3, The Cornish Tradition. While the Arthurian romances gave Lyonesse its most famous literary expression, the legend of a drowned land off Cornwall has roots that go far deeper than medieval literature. The people of Cornwall have their own rich tradition of stories about a lost land beneath the sea, stories that were passed down through generations of oral tradition long before they were written down by antiquaries and folklorists. In Cornish tradition, the lost land is often referred to not as Lyonesse but by its Cornish name, Lethowsow. This Cornish name is significant because it suggests that the tradition of a drowned land existed independently in Cornwall before it became entangled with the French-derived Arthurian legends. The Cornish language, a Celtic language closely related to Welsh and Breton, was the everyday language of Cornwall for centuries, and it preserved many traditions and stories that were distinct from the literary productions of the Anglo-Norman and French-speaking courts. The Cornish tradition tells of a land that extended westward from Land's End, a fertile country of farms and villages that was overwhelmed by the sea. In some versions of the story, the catastrophe is attributed to a great storm. In others, it is the result of a gradual encroachment of the sea, a slow drowning that gave the inhabitants time to see what was coming but not enough time to stop it. In still other versions, the flooding is presented as a divine punishment, a catastrophe sent by God to punish the wickedness of the people, echoing the biblical story of Noah's flood and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. One of the most detailed Cornish accounts of the drowning of Lyonesse comes from the tradition surrounding the Trevelyan family, one of the oldest and most prominent families in Cornwall. According to family legend, when Lyonesse was overwhelmed by the sea, only one man escaped, a knight named Trevelyan, who rode a white horse at full gallop ahead of the advancing waters, reaching the high ground of Cornwall just as the sea closed over the land behind him. The Trevelyan family coat of arms, which features a horse rising from the sea, is said to commemorate this legendary escape. This story of a lone survivor fleeing on horseback ahead of the flood is one of the most vivid and enduring elements of the Lyonesse legend. It has been retold countless times in books, poems, and songs, and it has become almost inseparable from the legend itself. The image of the horseman racing along the beach, spray flying from the horse's hooves, the wall of water rising behind him, is one of the great dramatic images of English folklore. But the Trevelyan story is not the only survival narrative associated with the drowning of Lyonesse. Other Cornish families have claimed their own ancestors escaped the flood, and there are traditions of entire communities fleeing to the higher ground that would become the Isles of Scilly. The parish church of Sunken, the westernmost parish in mainland Cornwall, has traditions associated with the flood, and local folklore speaks of the sound of church bells ringing beneath the sea, audible on certain calm evenings when conditions are right. This motif of the underwater bells is one of the most haunting elements of the Lyonesse legend, and it appears in the folklore of many coastal communities around Britain and indeed around the world. In the case of Lyonesse, the story goes that fishermen and sailors, passing over the drowned land in calm weather, can sometimes hear the bells of the sunken churches ringing far below, tolled by the movement of the tides and currents. This is a detail that speaks powerfully to the human imagination, the idea that the lost land is not entirely gone, that it still exists down there in the darkness beneath the waves, its churches still standing, its bells still ringing, a ghost kingdom preserved in the cold silence of the deep. The antiquary William Camden, writing in the late 16th century, was one of the first scholars to record the Lyonesse tradition in a systematic way. In his great work Britannia, first published in 1586, Camden described the tradition of a drowned land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, noting that local people believed the sea had overwhelmed a large area of formerly dry land. Camden was a careful and respected scholar, and his inclusion of the Lyonesse tradition in his survey of Britain gave the legend a degree of scholarly respectability that it had not previously enjoyed. Richard Carew, a Cornish gentleman and scholar, provided another important early account in his Survey of Cornwall, published in 1602. Carew wrote of the local tradition that the land between Cornwall and Scilly had once been above water, and he noted that fishermen sometimes brought up in their nets pieces of doors, windows, and other evidence of human habitation from the seabed. Carew was writing from direct knowledge of Cornwall and its traditions, and his account carries the weight of local testimony. These early modern accounts are valuable because they preserve traditions that were already old when they were written down. Camden and Carew were recording stories that had been told in Cornwall for generations, perhaps for centuries. The question of how old these traditions really are, and whether they preserve genuine memories of real events, is one that we will return to repeatedly in this documentary. The folklore of the Isles of Scilly themselves adds further layers to the Lyonesse tradition. The people of Scilly have their own stories of land loss, their own memories of a time when the islands were larger and more numerous, when areas now covered by shallow water were dry land where people lived and farmed. Archaeological evidence from the islands, which we will examine in detail later, strongly supports these traditions, showing that the Isles of Scilly were indeed much larger in the prehistoric and Roman periods, and that significant areas of formerly inhabited land have been lost to the sea in the last 2,000 years. The folklore also speaks of a great forest that once covered the land between Cornwall and Scilly, a forest whose remains can still be seen at very low tides in the form of ancient tree stumps and roots protruding from the sand and mud of the intertidal zone. These submerged forests are not legend, they are geological fact, and their existence has been known to local people for centuries. We will explore the science of these submerged forests in detail later, but for now, it is enough to note that their visible presence in the landscape has served as powerful evidence in the eyes of local people that the stories of a drowned land are true. There is also a tradition, particularly strong in the fishing communities of Mounts Bay on the south coast of Cornwall, of a drowned city or town called Langaro or Langona, said to lie beneath the waters of the bay. This tradition is distinct from the Lyonesse legend in its specific details, but shares the same fundamental theme, the idea that the sea has taken land that was once inhabited, that there are places beneath the waves where people once lived and worked and built their communities. Mounts Bay itself provides striking visual evidence for these traditions. At its center rises St. Michael's Mount, a dramatic tidal island crowned by a medieval castle and monastery. At low tide, St. Michael's Mount is connected to the mainland by a causeway, and in the surrounding shallows, the remains of a submerged forest are sometimes visible, ancient tree stumps preserved in the sand and peat, the ghostly remnants of a landscape that existed thousands of years ago when sea levels were much lower than they are today. The Cornish name for St. Michael's Mount is Carreg Lws in Cws, which translates roughly as the grey rock in the wood. This name is profoundly significant because it suggests that the Cornish people preserved a memory of a time when the mount stood not in the sea but in a forest, a memory that is confirmed by the physical evidence of the submerged forest in Mounts Bay. The fact that this memory was encoded in the very name of the place suggests that it is extremely old, reaching back perhaps thousands of years to a time when the landscape of Cornwall was radically different from what it is today. Chapter 4, the geological story. To understand whether the legend of Lyonesse might preserve a kernel of historical truth, we must turn from folklore to geology. The geological history of southwestern Britain is a story of dramatic transformation, driven by the great cycles of ice ages and interglacial periods that have shaped the landscape of the entire planet over the last 2 million years. During the last ice age, which reached its maximum extent around 20,000 years ago, enormous quantities of water were locked up in vast ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere. These ice sheets were miles thick in places, and the sheer volume of water they contained caused global sea levels to drop dramatically by as much as 120 meters, or nearly 400 feet, below their present level. At this time, the landscape of what is now the southwestern approaches to the British Isles looked utterly different from today. Britain was not an island but part of the European continent, connected to France by a broad land bridge across what is now the English Channel. The Celtic Sea, which today separates southwestern Britain from Ireland and Brittany, was largely dry land, a vast plain of tundra and grassland roamed by mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and herds of reindeer. In this Ice Age world, the area between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly was emphatically not underwater. It was high ground, a ridge of granite hills rising above the surrounding lowlands. What we now call the Isles of Scilly were the highest peaks of this ridge, and they were connected not only to each other but to Cornwall by a continuous stretch of dry land. This was not Lyonesse. No humans lived there at the glacial maximum, as the harsh climate and proximity to the ice sheets made the area uninhabitable, but it was the geological foundation upon which the Lyonesse legend would later be built. As the last ice age ended, beginning around 15,000 years ago, the ice sheets began to melt, releasing their stored water back into the world's oceans. Sea levels began to rise, slowly at first, then more rapidly. This process, known as post-glacial transgression, transformed the geography of northwestern Europe over a period of several thousand years. The land bridge connecting Britain to the European continent was flooded, creating the English Channel. The North Sea basin, previously a low-lying plain known to archaeologists as Doggerland, was gradually submerged. And around the coasts of Britain, the sea advanced inland, flooding river valleys, cutting off headlands, and transforming the coastline into something recognizable to modern eyes. In the area between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, this process of rising sea levels gradually reduced the extent of dry land. The low-lying areas between the granite hills were the first to flood, creating channels and inlets where there had previously been valleys and plains. As sea levels continued to rise, these channels widened and deepened, until eventually the granite hills became islands, separated from each other and from Cornwall by stretches of open water. This process was not instantaneous. It occurred over thousands of years, driven by the slow, relentless rise of the world's oceans, but it was not entirely gradual either. The rate of sea level rise was not constant. There were periods of rapid rise and periods of relative stability. And local factors such as changes in storm patterns, shifts in sediment transport, and the compaction of peat and clay deposits could cause the effective sea level in a particular area to change more rapidly than the global average. The geological evidence for this process is extensive and well documented. Cores drilled from the seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly have revealed layers of peat, preserved wood, and other organic material that were clearly deposited in a terrestrial, not marine, environment. These deposits show that the area was once covered by forests of oak, hazel, alder, and other trees, forests that were killed and eventually submerged as the sea level rose. Radiocarbon dating of these submerged deposits has allowed scientists to construct a timeline of when different areas were flooded. The results show that the process of submergence began in the early post-glacial period and continued for thousands of years. By around 4,000 years ago, the Isles of Scilly had become separated from the mainland, but the islands themselves were still much larger than they are today, and many areas that are now shallow sea were still dry land. This is a crucial point for the Lyonesse legend, because it means that the process of land loss in this area was ongoing during the period of human habitation. People were living on the Isles of Scilly and in the surrounding area while the sea was advancing, and they would have witnessed, generation by generation, the gradual disappearance of land that their grandparents and great-grandparents had known. The submerged forests that are visible at extreme low tides in many parts of the Cornwall and Scilly coastline are among the most dramatic physical evidence of this process. These forests consist of the preserved stumps and root systems of trees that grew in areas that are now below sea level. At locations such as Mounts Bay, the Isles of Scilly, and various points along the north and south coasts of Cornwall, these ancient tree stumps emerge from the sand and mud at the lowest tides, standing in their original growth positions, their roots still gripping the soil in which they grew thousands of years ago. The sight of these submerged forests is profoundly evocative. To stand on a beach at low tide and see the stumps of ancient trees emerging from the water, knowing that these trees once stood in a forest that stretched for miles across what is now open ocean, is to experience a visceral connection with the deep past. It is not hard to understand why the people of Cornwall, seeing these stumps generation after generation, developed and maintained a tradition of a drowned land. The evidence was literally right in front of their eyes. But the submerged forests tell us something else as well. They tell us about the environment that existed in this area before the sea arrived. Pollen analysis of the peat deposits associated with the submerged forests has revealed that the landscape was one of mixed deciduous forest, a green, wooded country of the type that the Lyonesse legend describes. This was not a barren, inhospitable wasteland. It was a landscape that could support, and did support, human communities. The question then is not whether there was once dry land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. There undoubtedly was. The question is not whether this land was inhabited. The archaeological evidence, as we shall see, shows that it was. The real question is about timing and scale. When did the last significant areas of land disappear beneath the sea? How rapidly did the final submergence occur? And could the process have happened recently enough and dramatically enough to be remembered in human tradition? These are the questions that have driven decades of scientific research, and the answers they have produced are both fascinating and, in some cases, surprising. Chapter 5. The archaeological evidence if Lyonesse was a real place, if there was indeed inhabited land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly that was subsequently lost to the sea, then we would expect to find archaeological evidence of human habitation in the areas that are now submerged. And indeed, such evidence exists in abundance. The Isles of Scilly are an archaeological treasure trove, home to a remarkable concentration of prehistoric monuments and artifacts that tell the story of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. But what makes the archaeology of Scilly particularly relevant to the Lyonesse legend is the evidence it provides for dramatic changes in the island's geography during the period of human occupation. The most striking archaeological evidence comes from sites that are now partially or wholly submerged by the sea. On several of the islands, prehistoric structures, stone walls, field boundaries, burial cairns, and the remains of dwellings can be seen extending below the current high water mark and disappearing into the sea. These structures were obviously not built underwater. They were constructed on dry land in a landscape that has since been inundated. One of the most important archaeological sites in the Isles of Scilly is the prehistoric settlement on Nornour, a small rocky islet in the eastern part of the archipelago. Excavations at Nornour have revealed a complex of stone buildings dating from the Bronze Age through the Roman period, spanning roughly 2,000 years of occupation. The site is particularly significant because it shows clear evidence of the impact of rising sea levels on the community that lived there. Over the centuries of its occupation, the inhabitants of Nornour were forced to adapt to the encroaching sea, modifying their buildings and changing their way of life as the available land shrank around them. The evidence from Nornour is consistent with a gradual but relentless process of land loss. The earliest buildings were constructed well above sea level, but as the centuries passed, later structures were built on higher and higher ground as the lower areas were flooded. Eventually, the site was abandoned altogether, presumably when the remaining land became too small and too exposed to sustain a viable community. Another crucial piece of evidence comes from the inter-island flats, the shallow, sandy areas between the main islands of Scilly that are exposed at low tide but covered by water at high tide. These flats are the remnants of the low-lying land that once connected the islands into a single larger landmass. Archaeological surveys of these areas have revealed the presence of field walls, stone structures, and other evidence of human activity beneath the shallow water, confirming that these areas were once dry, inhabited land. The most comprehensive archaeological study of the submerged landscape between the Scilly Islands was conducted by the Cornwall Archaeological Unit and later by the Historic Environment Service. Using a combination of aerial photography, geophysical survey, and underwater exploration, these studies have mapped the remains of ancient field systems, boundary walls, and other structures across large areas of the inter-island flats. The picture that emerges is of a landscape that was extensively farmed and settled in the Bronze Age and Iron Age, a landscape of small fields, stone-walled enclosures, and scattered farmsteads that would not have looked out of place in the rural Cornwall of the same period. The chronology of submergence revealed by these studies is particularly interesting. The evidence suggests that during the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, the main islands of Scilly were connected into a single large island, with extensive areas of fertile lowland available for farming. During the Iron Age and Roman periods, roughly 2,500 to 1,500 years ago, rising sea levels were progressively flooding these lowland areas, breaking the single large island into the separate islands we see today. By the early medieval period, the period when the Arthurian legends were taking shape, the process of fragmentation was well advanced, but significant areas of land were still being lost. The archaeological evidence shows that some areas of the inter-island flats that are now permanently submerged were still dry land, or at least accessible tidal flats as recently as 1,000 years ago. This timeline is significant because it means that the loss of land in the Isles of Scilly was occurring within historical memory. People living on the islands in the Dark Ages and early medieval period, the very period when the Arthurian legends were being composed, would have been aware that the sea was taking their land, that areas where their parents and grandparents had farmed were now underwater. They would have seen field walls and buildings disappearing beneath the tide, and they would have passed on stories of a time when the land was larger, more fertile, and more prosperous. But the archaeological evidence extends beyond the Isles of Scilly themselves. Between Cornwall and Scilly, beneath the waters of the open sea, there is evidence of a submerged landscape that was once above water. Fishermen have long reported bringing up artifacts in their nets from the seabed in this area, pieces of worked stone, fragments of pottery, and other objects that suggest human activity. While much of this evidence is anecdotal and difficult to verify, it adds to the picture of a landscape that was once inhabited and is now lost beneath the waves. More systematic evidence comes from marine geological surveys, which have used sonar and other technologies to map the seabed between Cornwall and Scilly. These surveys have revealed features that are consistent with a drowned terrestrial landscape, river channels, valley systems, and other geomorphological features that would have been created by running water on dry land. These features provide further confirmation that the area was once above sea level, and they help us to reconstruct what the landscape would have looked like before the sea arrived. The archaeological evidence from Cornwall itself also contributes to the Lyonesse story. Along the Cornish coast, particularly in the southwest around Land's End and in Mounts Bay, there are numerous sites where archaeological remains extend below the current sea level. Submerged forests, as we have already discussed, are visible at many points along the coast, but there are also submerged archaeological features, stone walls, midden deposits, and other evidence of human activity that demonstrate that the coastline of Cornwall was once significantly further out to sea than it is today. At Porthcillier on the island of St. Agnes in the Isles of Scilly, a remarkable discovery was made in the form of a prehistoric cist grave, a stone-lined burial that had been exposed by coastal erosion. The grave was found at beach level, in a position that would have been well inland when it was originally constructed. The bones within the grave were dated to around 2000 BC, placing the burial firmly in the Bronze Age. The fact that a burial that was originally located well above sea level and some distance from the coast is now at beach level and being washed by the waves is a powerful illustration of the extent of land loss in the Isles of Scilly over the last 4,000 years. Perhaps the most evocative archaeological discoveries in the Scilly region are the remains of ancient hedgerows and field boundaries that can be seen on the inter-island flats at the lowest tides. These field walls, built of carefully placed stones in the characteristic Cornish style, are the remains of a farming landscape that was established in the Bronze Age and continued in use for centuries before being overwhelmed by the sea. Walking among these submerged walls at low tide, seeing the neat lines of stones stretching across the sand, marking out fields where crops once grew and cattle once grazed, is one of the most powerful experiences available to anyone interested in the Lyonesse legend. Here, in the most tangible form possible, is evidence that the stories are true, that there was once a land here, a land where people lived and worked, and that the sea has taken it away. Chapter 6, The Science of Submergence, Understanding How and Why Lyonesse, or rather, the real land that inspired the legend, was lost, requires a deeper dive into the science of sea level change and coastal processes. The story of post-glacial sea level rise is one of the great narratives of Earth science, and it has particular relevance to the coastal communities of northwestern Europe, which have been profoundly affected by changes in sea level over the last 10,000 years. As we have already noted, global sea levels at the peak of the last ice age were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. The rise from this low point to current levels did not occur at a constant rate. Instead, it happened in a series of pulses, periods of rapid rise alternating with periods of relative stability, driven by the complex dynamics of ice sheet melting. In the immediate post-glacial period, roughly 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose rapidly. During some phases of this period, the rate of rise may have been as much as 1 to 2 meters per century, a rate fast enough to be noticeable within a human lifetime, but slow enough to be experienced as a gradual process rather than a sudden catastrophe. During this period, the land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly was progressively flooded, and the Scilly archipelago began to take shape as the higher ground emerged as islands from the rising waters. By around 6,000 years ago, global sea levels had risen to within a few meters of their present level, and the rate of rise slowed considerably. But the rise did not stop entirely. Over the last 6,000 years, sea levels in the Cornwall and Scilly area have continued to rise, albeit at a much slower rate, perhaps 1 to 2 meters over the entire period. This may not sound like much, but in a landscape of gentle gradients and low-lying terrain, even a small rise in sea level can translate into a significant horizontal advance of the shoreline. But sea level rise alone does not tell the whole story. The relationship between the land and the sea is not simply a matter of water rising. The land itself can also move, either rising or sinking relative to sea level, and this process, known as isostatic adjustment, has been a significant factor in the geology of the British Isles since the end of the Ice Age. During the Ice Age, the northern parts of Britain were covered by a thick ice sheet, whose enormous weight pressed the land's surface downward. When the ice melted, the land began to rebound, slowly rising back toward its pre-glacial level. This process of isostatic rebound is still ongoing in Scotland and northern England, where the land is rising at a rate of 1 to 2 millimeters per year. But isostatic rebound in the north has a counterpart in the south. The removal of the ice sheet's weight from northern Britain caused the northern part of the island to rise, but this rising was accompanied by a corresponding sinking of the southern part, a process that can be likened to a seesaw, with northern Britain rising and southern Britain sinking. Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, located at the far southwestern tip of Britain, are in the sinking zone, and this isostatic subsidence has contributed to the relative rise in sea level experienced in this area. The combined effect of global sea level rise and local isostatic subsidence means that the relative sea level in the Cornwall and Scilly area has risen by several meters over the last few thousand years. This is sufficient to account for the flooding of the low-lying areas between the Scilly Islands and the loss of significant areas of coastal land around Cornwall. But there is another factor that must be considered: the role of storms and extreme weather events. Even when average sea levels are relatively stable, individual storms can cause dramatic and sudden changes to the coastline. Storm surges, temporary rises in sea level caused by low atmospheric pressure and strong onshore winds, can push the sea far inland, flooding areas that are normally above water. In extreme cases, storm surges can breach coastal defenses, erode protective sand dunes and barrier beaches, and permanently change the shape of the coastline. This is where the Lyonesse legend becomes particularly interesting from a geological perspective. The legend describes a sudden, catastrophic event, a single night in which the sea overwhelmed an entire kingdom. While the gradual, long-term rise in sea level cannot account for such a sudden event, a major storm surge could. If a powerful storm, coinciding with a high spring tide, struck a coastline that was already vulnerable due to long-term sea level rise, the result could be a dramatic and sudden loss of land, a catastrophe that would have seemed to the people experiencing it like the end of the world. Evidence from other parts of the North Sea and the English Channel shows that such events have occurred in historical times. The great storms of the 13th and 14th centuries caused devastating flooding along the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, and eastern England, permanently altering the coastline and destroying entire communities. The St. Lucia's flood of 1287 and the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 are among the most destructive, each killing thousands of people and submerging large areas of formerly inhabited land. Could a similar event have occurred in the Cornwall and Scilly area? The geological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. There are deposits in the Isles of Scilly that may represent the aftermath of major storm events, and there is evidence of sudden changes in the coastal environment that cannot easily be explained by gradual sea level rise alone. But the evidence is not sufficient to identify a single, specific event that could be the historical basis for the Lyonesse legend. What the scientific evidence does support is a more nuanced and in some ways more compelling story. The loss of land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly was a real process, driven by real geological forces. It occurred over thousands of years, but it accelerated during certain periods and was punctuated by sudden, dramatic events, storms, surges, and episodes of rapid erosion that would have been experienced by the inhabitants as catastrophic. Over generations, the cumulative effect of these changes, the slow, steady rise of the sea, the occasional sudden loss of land, the gradual shrinking of the inhabitable area, would have created a powerful collective memory of a land that was being taken by the ocean. This collective memory, passed down through oral tradition, elaborated by storytellers, and eventually merged with the literary tradition of the Arthurian romances, is what we know as the legend of Lyonesse. It is not a simple, accurate record of a single historical event. It is something more complex and in many ways more interesting, a mythologized memory of a real and ongoing process of landscape change, preserved in the language of legend and folklore. Chapter 7. The parallel traditions. The legend of Lyonesse does not exist in isolation. Around the coasts of Britain and northwestern Europe, there are numerous other traditions of drowned lands, lost kingdoms and cities swallowed by the sea. These parallel traditions provide valuable context for understanding Lyonesse, and they raise the intriguing possibility that they all reflect, in their different ways, the same great geological process, the post-glacial rise in sea levels that transformed the geography of northwestern Europe. The most famous of these parallel traditions is the story of Cantre'r Gwaelod, the Welsh legend of a drowned kingdom in Cardigan Bay on the west coast of Wales. According to Welsh tradition, Cantre'r Gwaelod was a low-lying kingdom protected from the sea by a series of dikes and sluice gates. The kingdom was prosperous and fertile, but one night, either through negligence or drunkenness, the keeper of the sluice gates failed in his duty, and the sea rushed in, flooding the entire kingdom and drowning its inhabitants. The parallels with the Lyonesse legend are obvious. Both stories describe a prosperous land destroyed by a sudden incursion of the sea. Both stories emphasize the catastrophic nature of the event, the speed with which the sea came in, the inability of the inhabitants to escape, the total destruction of a once thriving community. And both stories are associated with physical evidence that lends them a degree of credibility. In the case of Cantre'r Gwaelod, the remains of a submerged forest in Cardigan Bay, which are visible at low tide and which have been interpreted by local tradition as the remnants of the drowned kingdom's trees. The story of Cantre'r Gwaelod is preserved in the Black Book of Carmarthen, one of the earliest manuscripts of Welsh poetry, dating from the 13th century, though the tradition it preserves is almost certainly much older. The story appears in various forms in later Welsh literature, and it remains a powerful presence in Welsh culture to this day. Another significant parallel tradition comes from Brittany, the Celtic-speaking region of northwestern France that has deep cultural and linguistic connections to Cornwall and Wales. Breton folklore tells of the city of Wise, also known as Cur Wise, a magnificent city built on the coast of what is now the Bay of Douarnenez. According to the legend, Wise was protected from the sea by a great dike, the gates of which could only be opened with a golden key held by the king. The king's daughter Dahut was seduced by the devil, who tricked her into stealing the key and opening the gates. The sea rushed in, and the city was destroyed. The legend of Wise is one of the great stories of Breton folklore, and it has been retold many times in literature, music, and art. Like the Lyonesse and Cantre'r Gwaelod legends, it describes a prosperous land destroyed by a sudden incursion of the sea, and it is associated with physical evidence of coastal change, in this case, the presence of submerged structures and remnants of ancient settlements in the Bay of Douarnenez. The connection between the three traditions, Lyonesse, Cantre'r Gwaelod, and Wise, is particularly interesting because Cornwall, Wales, and Brittany are all Celtic-speaking regions with close historical and cultural ties. The peoples of these regions shared not only a family of related languages, but also a common cultural heritage, including a rich tradition of oral storytelling. It is possible that the flood legends of these three regions represent different local expressions of a shared Celtic tradition, a tradition that may have its roots in the actual experience of coastal communities during the period of post-glacial sea level rise. There are other drowned land legends in the British Isles as well. In the Firth of Forth in Scotland, there is a tradition of a drowned settlement beneath the waters of the estuary. Off the coast of Norfolk in eastern England, local tradition speaks of a drowned city, sometimes identified with the historical port of Dunwich, which was progressively destroyed by coastal erosion over several centuries. and off the coast of Yorkshire, the legend of the lost town of Ravensor describes a prosperous medieval port that was destroyed by storms and coastal erosion in the 14th century, a legend that in this case is confirmed by historical records. Beyond Britain, the tradition of drowned lands is found throughout northern Europe. The story of Vinta, a legendary city said to lie beneath the Baltic Sea off the coast of Germany or Poland, echoes many of the same themes as the Lyonesse legend. In the Netherlands, where the struggle between land and sea has been a central theme of national history for centuries, there are numerous traditions of drowned villages and flooded polders. And in Scandinavia, Norse mythology includes stories of great floods and the reshaping of the world by the power of the sea. These parallel traditions suggest that the legend of Lyonesse is not simply a local Cornish phenomenon, but part of a much broader tradition of flood mythology that extends across the entire coastal zone of northwestern Europe. This tradition appears to have its roots in the real experience of communities that lived through a period of dramatic coastal change, a period when the sea was visibly advancing, taking away land that had been inhabited for generations and reshaping the geography of the entire region. The comparative study of these traditions has become an important field of academic research in recent years, as scholars from disciplines including archaeology, geology, folklore studies, and linguistics have come together to explore the relationship between flood myths and geological reality. The emerging consensus is that while these legends should not be read as literal historical accounts of specific events, they do preserve genuine cultural memories of real environmental changes, memories that have been shaped, elaborated, and mythologized by centuries of oral transmission, but that nevertheless retain a core of historical truth. This is a remarkable conclusion because it suggests that human memory, transmitted through the medium of oral tradition, can preserve information about events that occurred thousands of years ago. The submerged forests, the drowned field walls, the archaeological remains beneath the waves, all of these provide physical evidence that the stories are rooted in reality. And the stories themselves, with their vivid imagery and emotional power, provide evidence of a different kind, evidence of how human communities experienced and made sense of a world that was changing around them in ways they could not control. Chapter 8. The medieval cartographic evidence. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Lyonesse legend is its relationship to medieval and early modern cartography. Maps from the medieval and Renaissance periods provide a fascinating window into how the geography of southwestern Britain was understood by contemporary scholars and navigators, and they offer tantalizing clues about the evolution of the Lyonesse tradition. The earliest maps of the British Isles are schematic and stylized, more concerned with representing the relative positions of places than with accurately depicting coastlines and geographical features. The famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300, shows Britain as a roughly triangular island in the northwest corner of the world, but its representation of Cornwall and the southwestern peninsula is too generalized to be useful for our purposes. More detailed maps of the Cornwall and Scilly area begin to appear in the 16th century, as advances in surveying techniques and navigational knowledge allowed cartographers to produce more accurate representations of the coastline. These maps are of great interest because they show the Isles of Scilly in varying levels of detail and, in some cases, seem to depict a geography that differs from what we see today. Some early maps of the Scilly area appear to show the islands as a single large landmass rather than the archipelago of small islands that exists today. This has led some commentators to suggest that these maps record a state of affairs that existed before further land loss fragmented the islands into their present configuration. However, this interpretation must be treated with caution. Early maps were often inaccurate in their depiction of small islands and complex coastlines, and what appears to be a single large island may simply be a cartographic simplification of a complex archipelago. Nevertheless, there are some intriguing cartographic details that deserve attention. A number of maps from the 16th and 17th centuries show rocks, shoals, and shallow areas between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly that are marked with names suggesting that they were once regarded as more significant features, perhaps as islands or even areas of dry land. The Seven Stones Reef, a dangerous shoal approximately halfway between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly, has been the site of numerous shipwrecks over the centuries and has long been associated with the Lyonesse legend. Some accounts describe the Seven Stones as the remnants of a larger land area, the last visible traces of the drowned kingdom. The Wolf Rock, another dangerous reef southwest of Land's End, has similar associations. Its name is sometimes said to derive from an old Cornish word meaning rock, but local tradition connects it to the idea of a drowned landscape, a last remnant of a land that once stretched far to the west. Maps from the period also show features on the Isles of Scilly that have since been lost to the sea. Comparison of historical maps with modern surveys reveals that some areas that were depicted as dry land in the 16th and 17th centuries are now below water, confirming that land loss in the Scilly area has continued into the historical period. This is particularly evident in the eastern part of the archipelago, where the low-lying flats between the islands have been progressively inundated. The cartographic evidence, while not conclusive in itself, adds another layer to the Lyonesse story. It confirms that the geography of the Cornwall and Scilly area has been subject to ongoing change, and it suggests that some areas of land that existed in the early modern period have since been lost to the sea. This is consistent with the geological and archaeological evidence we have already discussed, and it reinforces the idea that the Lyonesse legend reflects a genuine ongoing process of landscape transformation. Chapter 9, Tristan and Iseult, the love story of Lyonesse. No account of Lyonesse would be complete without a fuller exploration of the legend of Tristan and Iseult, the great love story that has made Lyonesse famous throughout the Western world. The story of Tristan and Iseult is one of the most influential narratives in European literature, and its connection to Lyonesse has ensured that the name of the lost kingdom has been preserved in the cultural memory of the English-speaking world long after its historical details have been forgotten. The earliest surviving versions of the Tristan story date from the 12th century, but the legend is almost certainly much older, with roots in Celtic mythology and oral tradition. The story exists in many versions, varying in detail but consistent in its broad outlines, and it has been retold by countless authors over the centuries, from medieval poets to modern novelists. The core of the story is as follows. Tristan is the son of King Meliodas of Lyonesse and his queen, who dies in giving birth to him. Raised by foster parents, Tristan grows into a young man of extraordinary courage, skill, and beauty. He travels to Cornwall, where he enters the service of his uncle, King Mark, and quickly distinguishes himself as a warrior and a knight. Tristan's first great feat is to defeat the Irish champion Morholt, who has come to Cornwall to demand tribute. Tristan fights Morholt in single combat and slays him, but he is wounded by Morholt's poisoned sword. Unable to find healing in Cornwall, Tristan disguises himself and travels to Ireland, where he is healed by the Irish princess Iseult, who does not know that Tristan was the man who killed her uncle Morholt. Tristan returns to Cornwall, but King Mark, hearing of Iseult's beauty, sends Tristan back to Ireland to fetch her as his bride. Tristan succeeds in this mission, but on the voyage back to Cornwall, he and Iseult accidentally drink a love potion that Iseult's mother had prepared for Iseult and Mark. The potion creates an irresistible passion between Tristan and Iseult, a love that will endure until death, but that brings nothing but suffering to everyone it touches. The rest of the story follows the tragic consequences of this forbidden love. Tristan and Iseult carry on their affair in secret, constantly in danger of discovery. King Mark suspects the truth, but is torn between his love for his nephew and his jealousy as a husband. Eventually, the lovers are discovered and Tristan is banished from Cornwall. He wanders in exile, performing great deeds of arms but always longing for Iseult. In some versions, he marries another woman, also named Iseult, Iseult of the White Hands, but he cannot forget his first love. The story ends in tragedy. Tristan is wounded in battle and lies dying. He sends for Iseult of Ireland, the only person who can heal him, asking that if she agrees to come, the ship should fly a white sail, and if she refuses, a black sail. Iseult comes, but Tristan's wife, jealous of her husband's love for another woman, tells the dying Tristan that the ship bears a black sail. Tristan, believing that Iseult has abandoned him, turns his face to the wall and dies. Iseult arrives to find him dead and, overcome with grief, dies beside him. This is one of the great tragic love stories of world literature, and its influence on subsequent literature and art has been immense. The story was a major source for the medieval concept of courtly love, which celebrated the idea of a passionate, all-consuming love that transcends social conventions and brings both ecstasy and suffering. It influenced Dante, Chaucer, and Shakespeare, and it was the inspiration for Richard Wagner's great opera, Tristan Iseult, one of the landmarks of 19th-century music. Lyonesse, as Tristan's homeland, is integral to the emotional and thematic fabric of the story. The fact that Tristan comes from a land that will one day be lost beneath the sea adds a layer of melancholy and inevitability to his story. Tristan is not just a knight whose love affair ends in tragedy. He is a man whose very homeland is doomed, a prince of a kingdom that will cease to exist. The drowning of Lyonesse mirrors the drowning of Tristan's hopes, the overwhelming of everything he loves by forces beyond his control. This connection between Tristan's personal tragedy and the larger tragedy of Lyonesse's destruction is not made explicit in the earliest versions of the story, which do not describe Lyonesse as a drowned land. But as the literary tradition evolved and the identification of Tristan's Lyonesse with the legendary drowned land of Cornish folklore became established, the two narratives, personal and geographical, became intertwined, each reinforcing the other and creating a story of extraordinary emotional and symbolic power. The Tristan legend also provides important evidence for the age and provenance of the Lyonesse tradition. Scholars who have studied the origins of the Tristan story have identified elements that appear to derive from very old Celtic traditions, including Welsh and Irish mythology. Some have argued that the character of Tristan has his origins in a historical figure, possibly a Pictish king named Drust or Drustan, and that the story of his love for Iseult may preserve elements of a pre-Christian Celtic love legend. If this is the case, then the association of Tristan with Lyonesse may be very old indeed, reaching back perhaps to the early medieval period or even earlier. The story of Tristan and Iseult has been retold many times in the modern era, and each retelling has brought new attention to Lyonesse. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the great Victorian poet laureate, included the story in his Idylls of the King, his epic retelling of the Arthurian legends. Algernon Charles Swinburne wrote a long narrative poem, Tristram of Lyonesse, published in 1882, which told the story with a lyrical intensity that matched the passion of its subject matter. Thomas Hardy, in his poem When I Set Out for Lyonesse, used the name as a metaphor for a journey into the unknown, a place of transformation and revelation. In the 20th century, the story continued to inspire writers, artists, and filmmakers. The French author Joseph Bédier published a reconstruction of the Tristan legend in 1900 that became a classic, and numerous novels, plays, and films have retold the story for modern audiences. In each of these retellings, Lyonesse has been present, sometimes as a fully realized setting, sometimes as a distant mythic backdrop, but always carrying with it the sense of a lost world, a place of beauty and wonder that has been taken away by the relentless forces of nature. Chapter 10, Exploring the Seabed in Recent Decades, advances in marine technology have opened up new possibilities for exploring the seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, offering the tantalizing prospect of finding direct evidence of the drowned landscape of Lyonesse. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, and sub-bottom profiling are among the technologies that have been used to survey the seabed in this area. These techniques allow scientists to create detailed maps of the ocean floor, revealing features that are invisible from the surface: submerged cliffs, drowned river valleys, ancient shorelines, and other geological features that tell the story of a landscape that was once above water. The results of these surveys have been remarkable. The seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly is not the featureless, flat plain that one might expect. Instead, it is a complex landscape of ridges, valleys, and plateaus, shaped by the same geological forces that created the land above water. The surveys have revealed the courses of ancient rivers that once flowed across the now submerged land, their channels still visible on the seabed as shallow depressions in the sediment. These rivers would have been the watercourses of Lyonesse, flowing through the forests and fields that once covered this area. The surveys have also revealed areas of the seabed where the sediment cover is thin, exposing the underlying bedrock. In some of these areas, the bedrock shows signs of weathering and erosion that are consistent with prolonged exposure to air, evidence that these surfaces were once above sea level and subject to the same atmospheric processes that shape the land surface today. Sub-bottom profiling, a technique that uses sound waves to penetrate beneath the seabed surface, has revealed layers of peat and organic material buried beneath the marine sediment. These deposits are the remains of the terrestrial environment that existed before the sea arrived, the bogs, marshes, and forest soils of the pre-submergence landscape. Samples of these deposits, brought to the surface by coring devices, have been analyzed using radiocarbon dating and pollen analysis, providing detailed information about the vegetation that grew on the now drowned land and the timing of its submergence. One of the most exciting recent developments has been the use of LiDAR, light detection and ranging, technology to survey the shallow waters around the Isles of Scilly. LiDAR uses laser pulses to create extremely detailed three-dimensional maps of the surface, and in shallow water, the laser can penetrate to the seabed, allowing researchers to map underwater features with unprecedented precision. LiDAR surveys of the inter-island areas of Scilly have revealed a wealth of features that are invisible to the naked eye: submerged walls, field boundaries, and other structures that confirm the existence of a formerly inhabited landscape beneath the shallow waters. These technological advances have transformed our understanding of the submerged landscape between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. We can now see, with a clarity that was unimaginable a few decades ago, the outlines of the drowned land, its hills and valleys, its rivers and forests, its fields and settlements. We can trace the courses of ancient paths and trackways, map the extent of former woodland, and identify the locations of human habitation. In a very real sense, we can now see Lyonesse not as a mythic kingdom of legend, but as a real landscape, preserved beneath the sea in all its complexity and detail. But there is much work still to be done. The seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly covers a large area, and much of it has yet to be surveyed in detail. The deeper waters further from shore are particularly poorly known, and it is in these areas that some of the most significant discoveries may yet be made. As technology continues to advance and as the scientific community devotes more resources to the study of submerged landscapes, our understanding of the drowned land of Lyonesse will continue to grow. There have also been diving expeditions to explore some of the submerged features identified by sonar and other survey techniques. Divers have visited sites on the inter-island flats of Scilly where submerged walls and other structures are visible on the seabed, and they have documented these features with photographs and video. The images they have brought back are haunting: stone walls standing in clear, shallow water, covered with seaweed and barnacles but still recognizably the work of human hands, the boundaries of fields where crops once grew in the sunlight and the open air. These diving expeditions have also revealed the challenges of underwater archaeology in this environment. The seabed is dynamic, constantly being reshaped by tides, currents, and storms. Features that are visible one year may be buried by sand the next, and archaeological remains are subject to ongoing erosion and degradation by the marine environment. Documenting and preserving these fragile remains is a race against time, and the limited resources available for underwater archaeology mean that much of the evidence may be lost before it can be properly studied. Despite these challenges, the work of exploring the seabed has already yielded results that are transforming our understanding of the Lyonesse legend. The physical evidence confirms what the legend has always claimed, that there was once a land here, a land where people lived, and that the sea has taken it away. The details of the story, the 140 churches, the single catastrophic night of drowning, the lone horseman escaping on his white horse, may be the embroideries of centuries of storytelling. But the core of the legend, the existence and destruction of an inhabited land, is supported by hard scientific evidence. Chapter 11, The Seven Stones and the Wolf Rock between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly. Two features of the seabed have long been associated with the Lyonesse legend, the Seven Stones Reef and the Wolf Rock. These dangerous shoals, rising close to the surface of the sea in the middle of an otherwise deep water passage, have been the site of numerous shipwrecks and have played a significant role in the folklore surrounding the lost land. The Seven Stones Reef lies approximately 15 miles west of Land's End and 7 miles northeast of the Isles of Scilly. It consists of a group of rocky outcrops, some of which are exposed at low tide, surrounded by an area of shallow water that is treacherous to navigation. The reef has been marked by a lightship, a permanently anchored vessel carrying a navigation light, since the 18th century, but before that, it was an unmarked hazard that claimed many ships and many lives. In local tradition, the Seven Stones are said to be the last visible remnants of Lyonesse, the highest points of the drowned land, still poking above the waves even after the rest of the kingdom has been submerged. This tradition is reflected in some of the local names for the reef, which include the Cornish name Lethowsow, a word that may be etymologically related to the name Lyonesse itself. The Seven Stones Reef achieved international notoriety in 1967 when the supertanker Torrey Canyon struck the reef and broke apart, releasing over 100,000 tons of crude oil into the sea. The resulting oil spill was one of the worst environmental disasters in British history, contaminating hundreds of miles of coastline in Cornwall, Brittany, and the Channel Islands. The wreck of the Torrey Canyon became a symbol of the dangers of the modern world's dependence on oil, but it also served as a grim reminder of the enduring treachery of the Seven Stones, a reef that has been claiming victims for centuries, perhaps for millennia. The Wolf Rock lies about 8 miles southwest of Land's End, a single pinnacle of granite rising from deep water to just above the surface. A lighthouse was built on the Wolf Rock in the 19th century, one of the most challenging feats of lighthouse engineering ever undertaken, but before the lighthouse was constructed, the rock was an unmarked danger, visible only when waves broke over it. Like the Seven Stones, the Wolf Rock has been associated in local tradition with the Lyonesse legend. It is said to be another remnant of the drowned land, a last fragment of a once great kingdom now reduced to a single wave-washed stone. The name Wolf Rock itself has been the subject of much speculation. Some scholars believe it derives from an Old English or Cornish word meaning simply rock or reef, but local tradition offers a more colorful explanation, that the rock was named for the howling sound made by the wind and waves as they passed over its surface, a sound that was said to resemble the howling of wolves. Whether or not the Seven Stones and the Wolf Rock are genuinely remnants of a drowned landmass, as opposed to natural submarine features that have always been submerged or nearly so, is a matter of geological debate. What is clear is that these features lie within the area that was once above sea level during the last ice age, and that they have been progressively submerged by the post-glacial rise in sea levels. In this sense, they are indeed remnants of a drowned landscape, even if they are not the ruins of a medieval kingdom. The dangers posed by these reefs and shoals have had a profound impact on the history of the region. For centuries, the passage between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly has been one of the most dangerous shipping lanes in the world, and the loss of ships and lives on the reefs and rocks of this area has been staggering. The wreck registers of the Isles of Scilly and the Land's End Peninsula list hundreds of vessels lost over the centuries, from small fishing boats to great warships and merchant vessels. The most devastating single shipwreck in the area occurred in 1707, when a fleet of Royal Navy warships, returning from operations in the Mediterranean under the command of Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel, ran onto the rocks of the western Isles of Scilly in a storm. 4 ships were lost, including the flagship HMS Association, and an estimated 2,000 sailors were drowned. It was one of the worst naval disasters in British history, and it demonstrated with terrible clarity the dangers of navigation in these waters. The frequency and severity of shipwrecks in the Cornwall and Scilly area contributed to the legend of Lyonesse in an indirect but significant way. The sea was not just a distant, abstract threat in this region, it was an ever-present danger, a force that regularly took lives and destroyed property. For the people of Cornwall and Scilly, the idea that the sea could overwhelm an entire kingdom was not a fantastic or incredible notion. It was a logical extension of their daily experience of the sea's power and unpredictability. Chapter 12, Literary Lyonesse, Poets and Dreamers. The legend of Lyonesse has inspired some of the most beautiful and evocative writing in the English language. From the medieval romances to the poems of the Victorian era and beyond, writers have been drawn to the image of the drowned kingdom, finding in it a powerful metaphor for loss, longing, and the passage of time. We have already mentioned Alfred, Lord Tennyson, whose Idylls of the King brought the Arthurian legends to a vast Victorian audience. Tennyson's treatment of Lyonesse is restrained. He uses the name primarily as a geographical reference, a place associated with Tristan and with the final battle of Arthur. But in his poem, The Passing of Arthur, the last of the Idylls, Tennyson creates a landscape that is saturated with the atmosphere of Lyonesse, a gray, desolate coastline where the waves crash on barren shores and the cry of seabirds echoes in the mist. It is in this poem that Arthur, mortally wounded in his last battle against Mordred, is carried to the shore and placed in a barge that bears him away to the Isle of Avalon. The setting is not named as Lyonesse, but its association with the western shores of Cornwall and the idea of a land disappearing into the sea is unmistakable. Tennyson's contemporary, Algernon Charles Swinburne, devoted an entire major poem to the Tristan legend and gave it the title Tristram of Lyonesse. Published in 1882, Swinburne's poem is a work of extraordinary verbal richness and sensual intensity, telling the story of Tristan and Iseult in language that is by turns passionate, melancholy, and ecstatic. Swinburne's Lyonesse is a place of wild beauty, a land where the sea and the sky meet in a blaze of light and color, and where the power of love and the power of nature are inseparable. Thomas Hardy, the great novelist and poet of Wessex, used the name Lyonesse in one of his most famous short poems, When I Set Out for Lyonesse. The poem describes a journey to a distant, unknown place, Lyonesse, 100 miles away, and the transformation that the journey brings. Hardy's Lyonesse is not the drowned kingdom of legend, but a real place. He was describing his first visit to Cornwall, where he met his first wife, Emma Gifford. But by using the name Lyonesse, Hardy invoked the entire weight of the Arthurian legend and the idea of a lost, magical world, transforming a personal experience into something larger and more universal. Hardy's use of the name is significant because it demonstrates how deeply the Lyonesse legend had penetrated English literary culture by the 19th century. For Hardy, Lyonesse was not just a place name, it was a word charged with meaning, a word that evoked mystery, romance, loss, and the tantalizing possibility of discovering something wonderful in an unexpected place. This is the power of the Lyonesse legend, its ability to transform a geographical location into a state of mind, a symbol of everything that has been lost and everything that might still be found. In the 20th century, the Lyonesse legend continued to inspire writers and artists. Walter de la Mare, the English poet and novelist, wrote a poem called Sunk Lyonesse that is one of the most beautiful literary treatments of the legend. The poem imagines the drowned kingdom lying beneath the waves, its towers and walls still standing in the green twilight of the sea, fish swimming through its halls, its bells still tolling in the deep. De la Mare's poem captures the essential mystery and melancholy of the Lyonesse legend, the idea of a world that exists just beyond the reach of the living, visible only in dreams and imagination. The legend has also found expression in visual art. Painters of the pre-Raphaelite movement, with their love of medieval subjects and their commitment to detailed, naturalistic representation, were drawn to the Arthurian legends and to the imagery of Lyonesse. Edward Burne-Jones, the great pre-Raphaelite painter and designer, created several works inspired by the Tristan legend, and his depictions of the Arthurian world, with their rich colors, flowing robes, and atmosphere of dreamy melancholy, have helped to shape the modern visual imagination of Lyonesse. In music, the Lyonesse legend has inspired works ranging from Richard Wagner's monumental opera, Tristan Iseult, to contemporary folk songs and ballads. Wagner's opera, first performed in 1865, is one of the supreme achievements of Western music, and its treatment of the Tristan legend, with its themes of forbidden love, transcendence, and death, has had an incalculable influence on subsequent art and culture. While Wagner's opera does not deal directly with the drowning of Lyonesse, its association of the Tristan story with the idea of an overwhelming, all-consuming passion that sweeps everything before it resonates powerfully with the image of a land swept away by the sea. The cumulative effect of all this literary, artistic, and musical engagement with the Lyonesse legend has been to embed the name and the story deep in the cultural consciousness of the English-speaking world. Lyonesse is not just a geographical legend, it is a cultural touchstone, a word that carries with it centuries of accumulated meaning and association. When we speak of Lyonesse, we are speaking not only of a drowned land off Cornwall, but of everything that the idea of a drowned land represents: the fragility of human civilization, the power of nature, the persistence of memory, the ache of loss. Chapter 13, The Breton Connection. The relationship between Cornwall and Brittany is central to the Lyonesse legend, and understanding this relationship helps to illuminate the origins and evolution of the story. Cornwall and Brittany are the two surviving strongholds of the Brythonic Celtic languages, Cornish and Breton, and they share a deep historical and cultural bond that stretches back to the early medieval period and beyond. According to tradition, Brittany was settled by Celtic-speaking migrants from Britain, particularly from Cornwall and Devon, during the 5th and 6th centuries AD. These migrations were driven by the upheavals of the post-Roman period, the withdrawal of Roman authority, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and the social and political turmoil that accompanied the transition from Roman Britain to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The British settlers in Brittany brought with them their language, their culture, and their stories, creating a Celtic-speaking community on the European continent that maintained close ties with its homeland across the Channel. The linguistic evidence for this connection is compelling. Cornish and Breton are closely related languages, more similar to each other than either is to Welsh, the other surviving Brythonic Celtic language. Speakers of Cornish and Breton would have been able to understand each other with relative ease, and the cultural exchange between the two communities was extensive and ongoing. This cross-channel connection is directly relevant to the Lyonesse legend because it provides a mechanism for the transmission of stories between Cornwall and Brittany. The Tristan legend, which is so closely associated with Lyonesse, shows clear signs of having passed back and forth across the Channel. The earliest surviving literary versions of the Tristan story were composed in French, but they draw on material that appears to have originated in the Celtic-speaking communities of Cornwall and Brittany. The place names, character names, and geographical references in the Tristan story reflect a blend of Cornish, Breton, and French elements, suggesting a complex process of cultural transmission and literary adaptation. The name Lyonnois or Lyonesse, which is the form of Lyonesse found in the French romances, has been identified by some scholars with the region of Lyon in northwestern Brittany. Lyon was a historical territory corresponding roughly to the modern department of Finistère, and it was one of the areas settled by British migrants in the early medieval period. If this identification is correct, then the original Lyonesse may not have been a drowned land at all but a real, existing territory in Brittany. This theory raises intriguing questions about how the name Lyonesse came to be associated with the drowned land off Cornwall. One possibility is that the association was the result of a misunderstanding or a deliberate conflation. As the Tristan story was retold and adapted by English writers, the French Lyonnois was gradually identified with the Cornish Lethowsow, and the two traditions, the literary tradition of Tristan's homeland and the folklore tradition of the drowned land, were merged into a single narrative. This process of conflation may have been facilitated by the genuine connections between Cornwall and Brittany and by the physical similarities between the two coastlines, both of which face the Atlantic, both of which have a history of coastal erosion and land loss, and both of which have traditions of drowned lands and sunken cities. The Breton legend of the City of Wise, which we discussed earlier, may also have played a role in the development of the Lyonesse legend. The story of Wise, a great city protected by a dike that is breached by treachery, allowing the sea to rush in and destroy everything, shares many elements with the Lyonesse legend, and it is possible that the two stories influenced each other as they were told and retold in the Celtic-speaking communities on both sides of the channel. The cross-channel connection also helps to explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the Lyonesse legend, its persistence. Stories of drowned lands are not uncommon in European folklore, but few have achieved the enduring fame and cultural significance of Lyonesse. The legend has survived for at least 1,000 years, and it shows no signs of fading. This remarkable persistence may be partly due to the ongoing physical evidence, the submerged forests, the eroding coastlines, the archaeological remains beneath the waves that has continually reinforced the tradition. But it may also be due to the literary and cultural networks that connected Cornwall, Brittany, and the wider Arthurian world, ensuring that the story was told and retold, elaborated and embellished by generations of storytellers, poets, and scholars. Chapter 14. Geological dating and the timeline of loss. One of the most important questions in the study of Lyonesse is the precise timeline of land loss. When did the last significant areas of dry land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly disappear beneath the sea? Was this a process that occurred entirely in prehistoric times, or did it continue into the historical period, the period when human communities were present and able to observe and remember what was happening? The answers to these questions have significant implications for the Lyonesse legend. If the last major land loss occurred thousands of years before the development of the Arthurian legends, then the legend cannot be a direct memory of the event, and its origins must be sought in other factors, perhaps in the observation of ongoing coastal erosion or in the discovery of submerged forests and archaeological remains. But if significant land loss occurred within the historical period, say, within the last 2,000 years, then it is possible that the legend does preserve a genuine memory of real events, transmitted through oral tradition from the time of the event to the time when it was first written down. The geological evidence on this point is complex and somewhat ambiguous. As we have discussed, the major phase of post-glacial sea level rise occurred between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, when global sea levels rose from their Ice Age low point to approximately their present level. During this period, the land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly was progressively flooded, and the Scilly archipelago was created as the higher ground emerged as islands. By 6,000 years ago, the main outlines of the present geography were in place, the Isles of Scilly were separate from Cornwall, and the main islands of the archipelago were beginning to emerge as distinct entities. But the process of land loss did not stop. Over the last 6,000 years, sea levels have continued to rise, albeit at a much slower rate, and the combined effects of sea level rise, isostatic subsidence, erosion, and storm damage have continued to reshape the coastline and reduce the area of dry land. The archaeological evidence from the Isles of Scilly, as we have discussed, shows that significant land loss occurred during the Bronze Age and Iron Age, roughly 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. Field walls and other structures that were built on dry land during this period are now below sea level, demonstrating that the effective sea level has risen by several meters in the last few thousand years. More recent evidence comes from historical records and cartographic sources. Comparison of historical maps with modern surveys suggests that some areas of the Isles of Scilly that were depicted as dry land in the 16th and 17th centuries are now below water, indicating that land loss has continued into the modern period. Historical records also document specific instances of storm damage and coastal erosion in the Cornwall and Scilly area, confirming that the coastline has been subject to ongoing change. The most significant piece of evidence for relatively recent land loss comes from the work of archaeologists and geologists who have studied the inter-island flats of the Isles of Scilly. Their research suggests that as recently as the Roman period, roughly 2,000 years ago, the main islands of Scilly were still connected by large areas of low-lying land, forming a single large island rather than the scattered archipelago we see today. The fragmentation of this single island into separate islands occurred gradually over the first millennium AD, driven by the continued rise in sea level and accelerated by storm damage and erosion. If this chronology is correct, then the final breakup of the Scilly super island occurred during the very period when the Arthurian legends were being composed, the 5th to 12th centuries AD. This means that the people who told the earliest versions of the Lyonesse story may have been living through the process of land loss that the story describes. They may not have witnessed the sudden, catastrophic drowning of an entire kingdom in a single night. The geological evidence does not support such a dramatic event, but they would have been aware that the land was shrinking, that the sea was advancing, and that areas where their ancestors had lived were now underwater. This is a crucial insight for understanding the Lyonesse legend. It suggests that the legend is not a simple fabrication or a borrowing from literary tradition. Rather, it is rooted in a real and ongoing experience of environmental change, an experience that was common to the coastal communities of southwestern Britain during the first millennium AD. The legend may exaggerate the scale and speed of the event, transforming a gradual process into a sudden catastrophe, but its core message, that the sea has taken land that was once inhabited, is grounded in reality. Chapter 15. The enduring mystery. As we come to the end of this first part of our exploration of Lyonesse, we find ourselves in a position that is both more informed and more intrigued than when we began. The legend of Lyonesse is not a simple story with a simple explanation. It is a complex phenomenon woven from many threads: Arthurian romance, Cornish folklore, geological history, archaeological evidence, literary tradition, and the enduring human fascination with lost worlds and vanished civilizations. What we know for certain is this: there was once dry land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. This land was inhabited by human communities who farmed its soil, built walls and houses upon it, and buried their dead in its earth. Over a period of thousands of years, this land was progressively submerged by the rising sea, until all that remained were the scattered islands that we know today as the Isles of Scilly. The physical evidence for this process, the submerged forests, the drowned field walls, the buried peat deposits, the archaeological remains beneath the waves, is overwhelming and beyond dispute. What we do not know with certainty is whether the legend of Lyonesse preserves a direct memory of this process, transmitted through oral tradition from the people who witnessed it to the storytellers who gave it its literary form. The timing is suggestive, significant land loss was occurring in the Cornwall and Scilly area during the very centuries when the Arthurian legends were taking shape, but the evidence is not conclusive. It is possible that the legend was inspired not by direct memory but by other factors: the observation of submerged forests and archaeological remains, the experience of ongoing coastal erosion, or the influence of similar legends from other parts of the Celtic world. What we can say is that the legend of Lyonesse, whatever its origins, has captured something true about the human experience of living on a changing coastline. The people of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly have lived for millennia on the edge of the land, in a place where the boundary between earth and water is constantly shifting. They have watched the sea take their fields and their homes, their churches and their cemeteries. They have heard the waves breaking over places where their grandparents walked on dry ground, and they have told stories about what was lost, stories that have grown and changed over the centuries, but that have never lost their essential truth. The legend of Lyonesse is also a story about the power of the human imagination to find meaning in the face of loss. The drowning of a land is a terrifying and devastating event, but the legend transforms it into something more: a tale of tragedy and heroism, of a kingdom lost and a lone survivor riding to safety, of church bells ringing beneath the waves in an eternal underwater liturgy. The legend does not deny the reality of the loss. Instead, it gives the loss a shape, a narrative, a meaning. It says that what was lost was worth remembering, and that the act of remembering is itself a form of survival. This is why the legend of Lyonesse continues to resonate so powerfully, even in an age of satellite mapping and seabed surveys. We may know more about the geology of the Cornwall and Scilly area than any previous generation, but we still feel the pull of the legend, the sense of mystery and melancholy that attaches to the idea of a drowned land. We still look out from Land's End toward the distant Isles of Scilly and wonder what lies beneath the waves. We still listen on calm evenings for the sound of bells ringing in the deep. In the second part of this documentary, we will continue our exploration of Lyonesse. We will delve deeper into the science of submerged landscapes, examining the cutting-edge research that is revolutionizing our understanding of how and when the land was lost. We will explore the connections between Lyonesse and other legendary lost lands, Atlantis, Doggerland, and the drowned cities of the Mediterranean. We will examine the impact of the Lyonesse legend on modern culture, from literature and art to environmental activism and climate change awareness. And we will ask the ultimate question: in an age of rising sea levels, could the story of Lyonesse be not just a memory of the past, but a warning for the future? The waves continue to break upon the shores of Cornwall as they have for thousands of years. The tides rise and fall, revealing and concealing the stumps of ancient forests, the foundations of drowned walls, the traces of a lost world. Somewhere beneath the gray waters of the Atlantic, the kingdom of Lyonesse still lies silent, submerged, but not forgotten. Never forgotten, the story continues. The bells still ring beneath the waves. The sea remembers what the land forgets. Beneath the gray Atlantic waters west of Cornwall, an ancient kingdom lies in silence, its fields and forests drowned, its churches and villages buried under fathoms of cold, salt water. In the first part of this documentary, we trace the legend of Lyonesse from its roots in Arthurian romance through the rich folklore of Cornwall, the geological record of post-glacial sea level rise, and the archaeological evidence of a drowned landscape between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. We discovered that the legend, far from being mere fantasy, is grounded in a real and demonstrable history of land loss, a process that transformed the geography of southwestern Britain over thousands of years, and that was witnessed, at least in its later stages, by the very communities who created and transmitted the legend. Now, in this second part, we go deeper. We will explore the cutting-edge science that is revealing the drowned landscape of Lyonesse in unprecedented detail. We will place Lyonesse in its broader context, examining its connections to other legendary lost lands around the world. We will trace the legend's influence on modern culture and its surprising relevance to the most pressing environmental challenge of our time. And we will return at last to the fundamental question that has haunted this story from the beginning: what does it mean to lose a world, and what can the loss of Lyonesse teach us about our own uncertain future? The bells still ring beneath the waves. Let us listen. Chapter 16. The new archaeology of submerged landscapes. The study of submerged landscapes has undergone a revolution in the early 21st century. What was once a niche field, pursued by a handful of dedicated specialists with limited resources, has become one of the most dynamic and exciting areas of archaeological and geological research. New technologies, new methodologies, and a new appreciation for the importance of underwater heritage have combined to create a golden age of discovery, and the drowned lands around the British Isles, including the landscape that inspired the Lyonesse legend, are at the forefront of this revolution. The transformation began with advances in remote sensing technology. Side-scan sonar, which sends pulses of sound across the seabed and creates images from the returning echoes, was the first technology to give researchers a clear view of the underwater landscape. But side-scan sonar has limitations. It produces two-dimensional images that can be difficult to interpret, and it cannot penetrate beneath the surface of the seabed to reveal buried features. The development of multi-beam bathymetry represented a major step forward. Multi-beam systems use arrays of sound beams to create detailed, three-dimensional maps of the seabed, showing every ridge, valley, and depression with remarkable clarity. When applied to the seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, multi-beam surveys have revealed a landscape of stunning complexity, a terrain of hills and hollows, plateaus and channels that was clearly shaped by the same geological processes that formed the land above water. But the most transformative technology has been sub-bottom profiling, which uses low-frequency sound waves to penetrate beneath the seabed surface and reveal the layers of sediment and rock below. Sub-bottom profiling is, in effect, a form of geological X-ray, allowing researchers to see what lies hidden beneath the sand and mud of the ocean floor. Applied to the Cornwall and Scilly area, this technology has revealed layers of peat, preserved wood, and other organic material buried beneath meters of marine sediment, the remains of the terrestrial landscape that existed before the sea arrived. These buried deposits are of immense scientific value. They contain pollen grains that reveal what plants were growing when the deposits were formed. They contain seeds, nuts, and fragments of wood that can be identified to species level, providing detailed information about the composition of the ancient forests. They contain insect remains, tiny shells, and other biological indicators that reveal the environmental conditions of the time. And they contain organic carbon that can be dated using radiocarbon techniques, allowing researchers to establish precisely when each layer was deposited. The picture that emerges from the analysis of these deposits is one of a landscape that changed dramatically over time. In the early post-glacial period, around 10,000 years ago, the area between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly was a landscape of birch and pine forest, gradually giving way to the mixed deciduous woodland of oak, elm, hazel, and lime that characterized the so-called Atlantic period of the Holocene, the warm, wet millennia that followed the end of the Ice Age. This was a rich, productive landscape teeming with wildlife, and it would have been an attractive environment for the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were the first human inhabitants of the region. As sea levels rose, the lower-lying areas were progressively flooded, and the forest gave way to salt marsh and tidal mudflat. The peat deposits that formed in these transitional environments are particularly rich in biological information, and they provide a detailed record of the process of submergence, a slow-motion chronicle of a landscape drowning. One of the most significant recent discoveries has been the identification of preserved ancient land surfaces beneath the seabed, surfaces that were once the ground upon which people walked. These surfaces, sealed beneath layers of marine sediment, sometimes preserve features such as footprints, tool marks, and the charred remains of hearth fires, the direct physical traces of human presence on the now drowned land. While such discoveries have been more common in other parts of the British Isles, particularly in the drowned landscapes of the North Sea. They represent the frontier of research in the Cornwall and Scilly area, and there is every reason to believe that similar finds await discovery in the waters around Lyonesse. The integration of these various technologies and datasets has allowed researchers to create comprehensive reconstructions of the drowned landscape. Detailed maps showing what the area between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly looked like at different periods in the past. These reconstructions show a landscape that was larger and more diverse than anything that exists in the area today, a landscape of rolling hills and sheltered valleys, of forests and meadows, of rivers and streams flowing to the sea. They show where the coastline was at different periods, how it changed over time, and where the last areas of dry land would have been located before the final submergence. These reconstructions are not just academic exercises. They have a profound emotional impact because they make visible, for the first time, the world that was lost. Looking at a map of the pre-submergence landscape, seeing the contours of hills that are now submerged, the courses of rivers that no longer flow, the outlines of forests that have been dead for millennia, is to experience a direct, visceral connection with the lost world of Lyonesse. The map gives substance to the legend, transforming the drowned kingdom from a fairy tale abstraction into a real, tangible landscape with geography, ecology, and history. The researchers who have created these reconstructions are the modern heirs of the medieval storytellers who first told the tale of Lyonesse. Both groups are engaged in the same fundamental project, the project of making the lost world visible again, of rescuing it from oblivion and restoring it to human consciousness. The methods are different, sonar and radiocarbon dating instead of poetry and song, but the impulse is the same. The deep human need to remember what has been lost, to keep faith with the dead, and to ensure that no world, however thoroughly drowned, is ever entirely forgotten. Chapter 17, Doggerland, Lyonesse greater cousin. To fully appreciate the significance of Lyonesse, we must place it within the context of a much larger story, the story of Doggerland, the vast submerged landscape that once connected Britain to continental Europe. Doggerland is, in many ways, the great lost land of the North Sea, and its story illuminates and parallels the story of Lyonesse in fascinating ways. During the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest, the area that is now the North Sea was a vast low-lying plain, stretching from the east coast of Britain to the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and Norway. This plain, which archaeologists have named Doggerland after the Dogger Bank, a large sandbank in the North Sea, was not a barren wasteland. It was a rich, diverse landscape of rivers, lakes, marshes, and forests, teeming with wildlife and inhabited by thriving communities of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Doggerland was enormous. At its maximum extent, it covered an area comparable in size to a modern European country, roughly the size of the United Kingdom itself. It was traversed by great rivers, the Thames, the Rhine, and others that flowed across its surface and merged into a single great river system that discharged into the Atlantic. Its climate was temperate, its resources were abundant, and its human population, while not large by modern standards, was well established and culturally sophisticated. Like Lyonesse, Doggerland was destroyed by the post-glacial rise in sea levels. As the ice sheets melted, the North Sea basin slowly filled with water, flooding the lowlands and driving the human inhabitants to higher ground. The process took thousands of years, but it was relentless and irreversible. By around 8,000 years ago, Doggerland had been reduced to a large island in the middle of the North Sea, an island that archaeologists call Dogger Island. And by around 6,000 years ago, even Dogger Island had been swallowed by the rising waters, and Britain had become the island it is today. The parallels between Doggerland and Lyonesse are striking. Both were inhabited landscapes that were progressively submerged by rising sea levels. Both left physical evidence of their former existence on the seabed, preserved peat deposits, submerged forests, and the traces of human habitation. and both have captured the human imagination, becoming symbols of the transience of human civilization and the power of nature to reshape the world. But there are important differences as well. Doggerland was much larger than Lyonesse, and it was submerged much earlier, largely during the Mesolithic period, before the development of agriculture, writing, or the complex societies that characterized the Bronze Age and later periods. As a result, Doggerland has left no direct trace in human folklore or legend. The people who lived there left no written records and no oral traditions that have survived to the present day. Everything we know about Doggerland comes from the physical evidence, the archaeology, the geology, the paleoenvironmental data retrieved from the seabed. Lyonesse, by contrast, was submerged much later, during a period when human societies were more complex and more capable of preserving and transmitting cultural memories. The people who witnessed the loss of Lyonesse were not nomadic hunter-gatherers, but settled farmers and fishermen, members of communities with established territories, social structures, and oral traditions. They were capable of remembering what had been lost and of transmitting that memory to future generations in the form of stories and legends. This difference in timing may explain why Lyonesse has a legend and Doggerland does not. The loss of Doggerland occurred too early to be preserved in human memory, too early for the people who experienced it to create a lasting narrative that could be passed down through the generations. The loss of Lyonesse, occurring thousands of years later, fell within the window of cultural memory, and the stories that were told about it survived long enough to be captured in written form by medieval scribes and storytellers. The study of Doggerland has been one of the great achievements of modern archaeology, and it has been driven by many of the same technologies that are being used to study the drowned landscape of Lyonesse. Multibeam bathymetry, sub-bottom profiling, and the analysis of cores and samples from the seabed have allowed researchers to create detailed reconstructions of the Doggerland landscape, showing its rivers, lakes, hills, and forests in remarkable detail. The results have transformed our understanding of European prehistory, revealing a lost world that was home to sophisticated human communities, and that played a central role in the cultural and biological history of the continent. The Doggerland research has also provided a methodological template for the study of Lyonesse. The techniques and approaches developed for the North Sea are now being applied to the waters around Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and the results are expanding our knowledge of the drowned landscape at an unprecedented rate. In this sense, Doggerland and Lyonesse are not just parallel stories, they are part of the same ongoing scientific project, the project of mapping and understanding the submerged landscapes of the European continental shelf. The comparison between Doggerland and Lyonesse also raises an important point about the nature of legend and historical memory. The fact that Doggerland, a landscape far larger and far more significant than Lyonesse, left no trace in human folklore, while Lyonesse is remembered in one of the most enduring legends of the Western world, tells us something important about the conditions under which cultural memories are formed and preserved. Memory requires not just experience, but also the cultural infrastructure to encode and transmit that experience, a community of storytellers, a tradition of oral narrative, a sense of place and identity that gives meaning to the act of remembering. The people of Lyonesse had these things. The people of Doggerland, living in a world before writing, before agriculture, before the settled communities that make sustained cultural memory possible, did not. Chapter 18, Atlantis and the Mythology of Lost Lands. No discussion of Lyonesse would be complete without addressing the elephant in the room, or rather, the sunken continent in the ocean. The legend of Atlantis, first described by the Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century BC, is the most famous lost land legend in the world, and its influence on the Lyonesse tradition and on the broader human fascination with drowned civilizations has been immense. Plato described Atlantis in 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. According to Plato, Atlantis was a great island civilization located in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar. It was a powerful and advanced society, rich in resources and skilled in engineering, that had conquered much of the Mediterranean world. But the Atlanteans became arrogant and aggressive, provoking the wrath of the gods, who destroyed the island in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods. Atlantis sank beneath the waves and was never seen again. The parallels between Atlantis and Lyonesse are obvious and have been noted by many commentators over the centuries. Both legends describe a prosperous land destroyed by a sudden incursion of the sea. Both legends emphasize the catastrophic nature of the event, the speed and completeness of the destruction. And both legends have inspired centuries of speculation about whether the lost land was real and, if so, where it was located. But the differences between the two legends are equally significant. Plato's Atlantis is a philosophical parable designed to illustrate moral and political themes, the dangers of hubris, the corruption of power, the fragility of civilization. There is no evidence that Plato intended his account to be taken as literal history, and most modern scholars regard Atlantis as a literary invention, a thought experiment rather than a geographical reality. Lyonesse, by contrast, is a local legend, rooted in a specific landscape and supported by specific physical evidence. The people who told the story of Lyonesse were not philosophers constructing an allegory. They were farmers and fishermen, priests and storytellers who lived on the edge of the sea and who saw, with their own eyes, the evidence that the land had once extended further. Their story was not an abstract meditation on the nature of civilization. It was a concrete, specific account of a real place that had been lost to the sea. Despite these differences, the Atlantis legend has had a profound influence on the way Lyonesse has been understood and interpreted. From the Renaissance onward, as knowledge of Plato's writings became more widespread in Western Europe, the Lyonesse legend was increasingly read through the lens of the Atlantis story. Lyonesse was described as the English Atlantis or the Cornish Atlantis, and the associations between the two legends, the shared imagery of sunken cities and drowned civilizations, became deeply embedded in popular culture. This association has been both a blessing and a curse for the study of Lyonesse. On the one hand, the comparison with Atlantis has helped to keep the Lyonesse legend in the public eye, ensuring continued interest in the drowned land and the research being conducted to understand it. On the other hand, the association with Atlantis, which has become a byword for pseudoscience and fringe theories, has sometimes made it harder for serious researchers to be taken seriously when they argue that the Lyonesse legend has a basis in geological and archaeological reality. The key distinction, and it is a distinction worth emphasizing, is that Lyonesse is not Atlantis. There is no credible evidence for the existence of Plato's Atlantis, and the vast majority of mainstream scholars regard it as a fiction. But there is abundant evidence for the existence of the drowned land that inspired the Lyonesse legend, and the scientific research that has confirmed this evidence is rigorous, peer-reviewed, and well-established. Lyonesse is not a fantasy. It is a real place, and its story is a real story, even if it has been embellished and mythologized over the centuries. The broader mythology of lost lands and sunken cities extends far beyond Atlantis and Lyonesse. Around the world, from the Pacific Islands to the coasts of India, from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, there are legends of lands and cities that have been swallowed by the sea. In Hindu mythology, the city of Dwarka, believed to be the kingdom of the god Krishna, is said to lie beneath the waters of the Gulf of Kutch off the western coast of India. In Japanese folklore, the dragon palace of Ryugujo lies beneath the sea, accessible only to those who are chosen by the sea god. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there are stories of lands that were once above water but are now submerged, stories that, remarkably, have been shown to correlate with the actual post-glacial flooding of the Australian coastline thousands of years ago. This worldwide prevalence of drowned land legends raises fascinating questions about the relationship between human culture and environmental change. Is it possible that many of these legends, like the Lyonesse legend, preserve genuine memories of real geological events? The research on Aboriginal Australian flood traditions suggests that it is. Studies by linguists and geologists have shown that some Aboriginal stories describe specific geographical features, bays, islands, river mouths, that came into existence as a result of post-glacial sea level rise, and that the stories accurately describe conditions that existed thousands of years ago. This suggests that oral tradition can, under the right conditions, preserve information about environmental events for extraordinarily long periods of time, perhaps 10,000 years or more. If this is the case, then the worldwide prevalence of drowned land legends takes on a new significance. It suggests that the post-glacial rise in sea levels, one of the most dramatic environmental changes in human history, left a deep and lasting impression on human cultures around the world, an impression that was encoded in myth and legend and preserved through millennia of oral tradition. The legend of Lyonesse, in this view, is not just a local Cornish tradition, but part of a global human response to a global environmental event, a response that finds expression in the mythology and folklore of cultures on every continent. Chapter 19. The environmental dimension in the early 21st century, the legend of Lyonesse has acquired a new and urgent relevance. As the world confronts the reality of climate change and its associated rise in sea levels, the story of a land drowned by the advancing ocean has become more than a historical curiosity or a literary fantasy. It has become a warning, a reminder that the sea has taken land before and that it will do so again. The scientific consensus on climate change is clear. The Earth's average temperature is rising, driven by the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This warming is causing the polar ice caps and glaciers to melt, releasing water into the world's oceans and causing sea levels to rise. At the same time, the thermal expansion of warming ocean water is adding to the rise. The current rate of sea level rise, approximately 3 to 4 millimeters per year, may not sound alarming, but it is accelerating, and projections for the coming century suggest that sea levels could rise by 1 meter or more by the year 2100. For the coastal communities of the world, this is a prospect of enormous consequence. A rise of 1 meter in sea level would flood vast areas of low-lying coastline, displacing millions of people, destroying infrastructure, contaminating freshwater supplies, and transforming the geography of entire regions. Small island nations in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Tuvalu, the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, face the prospect of complete submergence, their entire national territories disappearing beneath the waves, just as Lyonesse is said to have done. The parallels between the Lyonesse legend and the modern crisis of rising sea levels have not been lost on environmental campaigners, scientists, and writers. The legend has been invoked in countless articles, lectures, and documentaries as a powerful illustration of what can happen when the sea advances, a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic land loss that climate change threatens to bring about on a global scale. This use of the Lyonesse legend as an environmental parable has been both effective and controversial. On the one hand, the legend provides a vivid, emotionally compelling narrative that can help to communicate the abstract, statistical reality of sea level rise in a way that scientific graphs and data tables cannot. When people hear the story of a prosperous kingdom swallowed by the sea in a single night, they understand in an immediate, visceral way what is at stake. The legend makes the threat real and personal, transforming a scientific prediction into a human story. On the other hand, there are risks in using a legend as a tool of environmental communication. The Lyonesse legend, as we have seen, is not a simple, straightforward historical account. It is a complex cultural artifact shaped by centuries of storytelling, literary adaptation, and mythological embellishment. To use it as a direct analogy for modern sea level rise is to simplify both the legend and the science, potentially distorting both in the process. Nevertheless, the fundamental parallel between the legend of Lyonesse and the modern threat of sea level rise is real and significant. The geological processes that drown the land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, the melting of ice, the thermal expansion of water, the slow but relentless rise of the ocean, are the same processes that are driving sea level rise today. The difference is that the post-glacial sea level rise that drowned Lyonesse was a natural process, driven by the end of an ice age, while the current rise is being accelerated by human activity. But the physical result is the same. The sea is advancing and the land is retreating. The people of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly understand this better than most. They live on a coastline that has been shaped by millennia of sea level rise, and they are acutely aware of the continuing vulnerability of their land to the power of the ocean. Coastal erosion is an ongoing issue in Cornwall, with cliffs crumbling, beaches narrowing, and coastal paths collapsing into the sea with increasing frequency. The Isles of Scilly, low-lying and exposed, are particularly vulnerable, and the island communities face difficult questions about how to protect their homes and livelihoods in the face of a rising sea. In this context, the legend of Lyonesse is not just a story from the past. It is a living reality, a present-tense experience of a land under threat from the same forces that destroyed it before. The people of Cornwall and Scilly do not need to imagine what it is like to lose land to the sea. They see it happening around them every day in the eroded cliffs, the flooded fields, the storm-damaged sea walls. For them, Lyonesse is not an ancient legend but a daily reality, and its story is their story, continuing to unfold with each passing year. Chapter 20. The cultural legacy in the modern world. The legend of Lyonesse continues to exert a powerful influence on modern culture, inspiring works of literature, art, music, and film that reach audiences around the world. In this chapter, we explore some of the most significant modern expressions of the Lyonesse legend and consider what they tell us about the enduring appeal of the drowned kingdom. In literature, the Lyonesse legend has inspired a remarkable diversity of works, from epic fantasy novels to intimate lyric poems. One of the most significant modern literary treatments is Jack Vance's science fiction and fantasy series, Lyonesse, published in 3 volumes between 1983 and 1989. Vance's Lyonesse is a richly imagined fantasy world set on a group of islands in the Elder Isles, which are destined to sink beneath the sea. The series draws heavily on Arthurian legend and Celtic mythology, and its vivid, detailed world-building has earned it a devoted following among fans of fantasy literature. Vance's novels are notable for the way they combine the Lyonesse legend with other elements of European folklore and mythology, creating a world that is both familiar and strange, rooted in tradition, but shaped by individual imagination. The Elder Isles of Vance's creation are a place of magic and intrigue, of courtly manners and brutal violence, of beauty and decay, a world that captures the essential ambiguity of the Lyonesse legend, its blend of splendor and doom. Other modern novelists have also drawn on the Lyonesse legend. Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising sequence, a series of fantasy novels for young readers published in the 1960s and 1970s, uses Arthurian legend extensively and includes references to Lyonesse and the drowned lands of British mythology. The series has been hugely influential in the development of modern children's fantasy literature, and its use of the Lyonesse motif has introduced the legend to generations of young readers. In poetry, the Lyonesse legend has continued to inspire writers long after the Victorian era. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats, though not directly writing about Lyonesse, drew extensively on Celtic mythology and the imagery of drowned lands in his work, and his influence on later poets who did engage with the Lyonesse legend has been significant. The English poet Charles Cossley, a Cornishman born in Launceston, wrote poems that drew on Cornish folklore and landscape, including references to the lost lands off the coast. Cossley's work, rooted in the specific landscape and culture of Cornwall, provides a modern literary connection to the tradition of the drowned kingdom. The legend has also found expression in the visual arts. Contemporary artists working in Cornwall have been drawn to the imagery of the drowned land, creating paintings, sculptures, and installations that explore the themes of loss, memory, and the power of the sea. The dramatic landscape of the Cornish coast, its cliffs, beaches, and stormy skies, provides a powerful visual backdrop for artistic explorations of the Lyonesse theme, and the tradition of artists working in Cornwall stretches back to the late 19th century, when the colonies of artists at St. Ives and Newlyn made the Cornish landscape one of the most painted in the world. In music, the Lyonesse legend has inspired compositions ranging from classical orchestral works to folk songs and popular ballads. The English composer Rutland Botton, who was deeply influenced by Arthurian legend, composed works that drew on the Lyonesse tradition. More recently, contemporary folk musicians in Cornwall and beyond have created songs and musical settings that tell the story of the drowned kingdom, keeping the legend alive in the oral and musical traditions that have always been its natural home. Film and television have also engaged with the Lyonesse legend, though less frequently than one might expect given the dramatic potential of the story. The Arthurian legends have been the subject of numerous films and television series, from the classic Hollywood productions of the mid-20th century to the big-budget fantasy series of recent years, and Lyonesse has appeared in some of these productions as a setting or a reference. But a definitive film treatment of the Lyonesse legend, a production that places the drowned kingdom at the center of the story rather than relegating it to the background, has yet to be made. This may be a matter of time. The cinematic possibilities of the Lyonesse story, the dramatic images of a land sinking beneath the waves, the lone horseman fleeing ahead of the flood, the bells ringing in the deep, are so compelling that it seems inevitable that a filmmaker will one day bring them to the screen. The influence of the Lyonesse legend on modern culture extends beyond specific works of art and literature. The legend has become part of the broader cultural vocabulary, a reference point that is used and understood across a wide range of contexts. When a journalist writes about a coastal community threatened by erosion, they may invoke Lyonesse. When a politician warns about the dangers of climate change, they may reference the drowned kingdom. When a traveler describes a journey to the far west of Cornwall, they may speak of venturing into Lyonesse. The name has become a shorthand for a particular set of ideas and emotions: loss, nostalgia, the fragility of the human world in the face of natural forces, and this shorthand is understood and shared by a wide audience. This cultural pervasiveness is in itself a remarkable achievement for a legend that originated in a small corner of one country. The story of Lyonesse has traveled far from its Cornish origins, and it has been embraced by people who may never have visited Cornwall, who may never have stood on the cliffs at Land's End or gazed out toward the Isles of Scilly. The universality of the legend's themes, the loss of homeland, the power of the sea, the persistence of memory, has given it a resonance that transcends its local origins and speaks to the human condition in general. Chapter 21, The Identity of Cornwall. The Lyonesse legend is not just a story about a lost land. It is a story about the identity of Cornwall itself, about what it means to be Cornish, to live on the edge of the land, to belong to a culture that has always been shaped by its relationship with the sea. Cornwall occupies a unique position in the cultural geography of Britain. It is the far southwestern tip of the island, a long, narrow peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic, tapering to a point at Land's End. Its geography has given it a distinctiveness that sets it apart from the rest of England, a distinctiveness expressed in its language, its culture, its folklore, and its sense of identity. The Cornish people have always been aware of their separateness. Cornwall was one of the last parts of Britain to be absorbed into the English kingdom, and the Cornish language, a Celtic language related to Welsh and Breton, survived as a community language into the 18th century, far later than is sometimes supposed. Even today there is a strong movement to revive the Cornish language, and it is taught in schools, used in public signage, and spoken by a growing number of enthusiasts. The Lyonesse legend is an important part of this Cornish identity. The story of a lost land off the Cornish coast is not just a historical curiosity for the people of Cornwall. It is a statement about who they are and where they come from. It says that Cornwall is not just the land you can see, the fields and moors, the cliffs and beaches, the towns and villages. Cornwall is also the land you cannot see, the drowned kingdom beneath the waves, the hidden country that exists only in memory and imagination. To be Cornish is to carry this awareness of the lost land within you, to know that your heritage extends beyond the visible world into a realm that can only be reached through story and song. This sense of a dual landscape, the visible and the invisible, the present and the past, is a powerful element of Cornish culture, and it finds expression not only in the Lyonesse legend, but in the broader folklore of the region. Cornwall is a land of legends, a place where the boundary between the everyday world and the world of myth and magic has always been thin. The Cornish landscape is populated with giants and fairies, saints and sinners, mermaids and monsters, and the stories associated with these beings are not just entertainment. They are expressions of a deep, long-standing relationship between the people and their land. The Lyonesse legend fits naturally into this rich folklore tradition. It takes the Cornish experience of the sea, the ever-present awareness of the ocean's power, the daily reality of living on a coast that is constantly being shaped and reshaped by waves and storms, and transforms it into a grand narrative of loss and survival. The legend acknowledges the vulnerability of the Cornish land to the sea, but it also celebrates the resilience of the Cornish people, their ability to survive, to adapt, to remember what has been lost, and to carry that memory forward into the future. The Trevelyan legend, with its image of the lone horseman riding ahead of the flood, is a perfect encapsulation of this theme. The horseman is Cornish identity personified, a figure who has lost everything, whose homeland has been destroyed, but who survives, who reaches safety, and who carries with him the memory of what was lost. The Trevelyan coat of arms, with its horse rising from the waves, is a symbol not just of one family's legendary escape, but of the Cornish spirit itself, a spirit that has survived invasion, cultural suppression, economic hardship, and the relentless erosion of the sea. In the modern era, the Lyonesse legend has become an important element of Cornish cultural revival. As the Cornish people have sought to reclaim and celebrate their distinctive identity, the legend of the lost land has taken on new significance as a symbol of cultural persistence and resistance. The legend says that Cornwall has always been diminished by outside forces, first by the sea, then by the political and cultural dominance of England, but that the Cornish spirit endures like the sound of bells ringing beneath the waves, audible to those who listen. This cultural dimension of the Lyonesse legend is sometimes overlooked in the scientific and literary discussions of the story, but it is of profound importance. For the people of Cornwall, Lyonesse is not just a geological phenomenon or a literary motif. It is a living part of their cultural heritage, a story that helps them to understand who they are and where they come from. And in a world where many indigenous and minority cultures are struggling to survive in the face of globalization and cultural homogenization, the role of legends like Lyonesse in maintaining cultural identity and cohesion should not be underestimated. Chapter 22, The Isles of Scilly. Today the Isles of Scilly, those scattered granite fragments rising from the Atlantic 28 miles off the coast of Cornwall, are the last visible remnants of the land that inspired the Lyonesse legend. A visit to the Scilly Isles today is, in a very real sense, a visit to what remains of Lyonesse, the hilltops of a drowned landscape, the highest points of a lost country that is otherwise entirely beneath the sea. The islands are a place of extraordinary beauty. The combination of clear Atlantic waters, white sand beaches, and a mild climate tempered by the Gulf Stream gives them a character that is unique in the British Isles, more reminiscent at times of the Mediterranean or the Caribbean than of the gray, wind-swept north. Subtropical plants thrive in the sheltered gardens of Tresco, one of the 5 inhabited islands, and the surrounding waters are home to gray seals, dolphins, and a remarkable diversity of seabirds. But beneath this beauty lies a landscape shaped by loss. The evidence of the drowned land is everywhere on the islands, visible to anyone who knows where to look. At low tide, the entire island flats are exposed, revealing the sand and seaweed-covered remains of ancient field walls stretching between the islands. On the beaches, storms occasionally expose layers of peat and the stumps of ancient trees, the remnants of forests that grew here when the islands were a single, larger landmass. And in the waters around the islands, just beneath the surface, lie the traces of a landscape that was once home to a thriving community of farmers and fishermen. The inhabited islands of Scilly, St. Mary's, Tresco, St. Martin's, Bryher, and St. Agnes are small, none more than a few miles across, and their combined population is only around 2,000 people. Life on the islands is shaped by the sea in every respect. The weather, the economy, the daily rhythm of work and leisure are all determined by the ocean that surrounds them. The islanders are acutely aware of their vulnerability to the sea, and the legends of lost land are not abstract history for them, but a reflection of their lived experience. The island of Samson, now uninhabited, provides a poignant illustration of the continuing process of land loss. Samson was inhabited until the mid-19th century, when the last residents were removed. Some accounts say voluntarily, others say under pressure from the island's proprietor. The reasons for the abandonment were complex, but the declining viability of farming on the small, exposed island was a significant factor, and the encroachment of the sea on the island's limited agricultural land was part of this decline. Today, the ruins of the former settlement are visible on the island, and at low tide, field walls extend out from the shore into the shallow water, marking the extent of land that has been lost since the fields were last cultivated. The archaeology of Scilly has been a major focus of research, and the work of archaeologists on the islands has done more than anything else to establish the factual basis of the Lyonesse legend. The English Heritage Survey of the Isles of Scilly, conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, documented hundreds of archaeological sites across the islands, ranging from Neolithic tombs to medieval field systems. Many of these sites are located at or near sea level, and some are being actively eroded by the sea, providing urgent motivation for continued research and recording. The entrance graves of the Isles of Scilly are among the most distinctive archaeological features of the islands. These prehistoric burial monuments, dating from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, consist of stone-lined chambers set into low mounds, with a passage leading from the chamber to the outside. There are over 80 known entrance graves on Scilly, a remarkable concentration for such a small area, and their presence speaks to the importance of the islands in the ritual and ceremonial life of their prehistoric inhabitants. Many of these entrance graves are located on the coasts of the islands, and some are being actively damaged by coastal erosion. The grave on Porthhellick, St. Mary's, discovered in the 19th century, was found to contain cremated human remains and pottery dating from around 2000 BC. Its coastal location suggests that when it was built, the coastline was further out to sea than it is today, and the grave was originally set in a landscape that has since been partially eroded away. The Romano-British shrine on Nornour, which we discussed in Part 1, remains one of the most important archaeological sites on Scilly. The discovery of hundreds of Roman-period brooches, rings, and other votive objects at the site suggests that it was a place of pilgrimage or worship, visited by people from both the islands and the mainland. The shrine's location on a small, exposed islet that would have been much larger in the Roman period underscores the extent of land loss in the intervening centuries. Today, the Isles of Scilly are facing new challenges as climate change accelerates the rate of sea level rise and increases the frequency and intensity of storms. The winter storms of 2014, which caused severe flooding and damage across the islands, provided a dramatic illustration of the island's vulnerability and prompted renewed discussion about how to protect the island communities in the face of a changing climate. For the people of Scilly, the legend of Lyonesse is not a distant memory but a present concern, a reminder that the process that created the islands by drowning the land around them has not stopped and may indeed be accelerating. Chapter 23, Oral Tradition and the Transmission of Memory. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Lyonesse legend is the question of how it was preserved and transmitted through time. If the legend does, as we have argued, contain a kernel of genuine historical memory, a memory of real land loss in the Cornwall and Scilly area, then it must have been transmitted through many generations of oral tradition before being written down by medieval scribes and storytellers. Understanding how this transmission occurred is a crucial part of understanding the legend itself. Oral tradition, the transmission of knowledge, stories, and cultural information through spoken language rather than writing, is one of the oldest and most universal forms of human communication. Every culture in the world has relied on oral tradition at some point in its history, and many cultures continue to rely on it today. Oral tradition is the medium through which myths and legends, genealogies and histories, songs and poems, laws and customs have been passed from generation to generation for millennia. But oral tradition is not simply a primitive form of writing. It has its own rules, its own structures, and its own strengths and limitations. One of the key features of oral tradition is that it is not a passive process of memorization and repetition. Oral traditions are actively maintained by their communities, retold, elaborated, adapted, and updated as circumstances change and as new information becomes available. This means that oral traditions are not static, fixed texts but living, evolving narratives that change over time while preserving a core of essential meaning. This understanding of oral tradition has important implications for the Lyonesse legend. If the legend was transmitted through oral tradition, then we should not expect it to be a precise, accurate, and unchanging record of a specific historical event. Instead, we should expect it to be a narrative that has been shaped and reshaped by generations of storytellers, each adding their own details, their own embellishments, their own interpretations. The core of the story, the fundamental fact that land was lost to the sea, may be historically accurate, but the specific details, the 140 churches, the single night of drowning, the lone horseman escaping on his white horse, are likely to be the products of centuries of storytelling. Research into the mechanisms of oral tradition has revealed some remarkable findings about the capacity of human memory and the reliability of orally transmitted information. Studies of oral traditions in cultures around the world, from Aboriginal Australia to West Africa, from the Pacific Islands to Northern Europe, have shown that oral traditions can preserve accurate information about real events for extraordinarily long periods of time. The Aboriginal Australian flood traditions mentioned earlier, which accurately describe geographical conditions that existed thousands of years ago, are perhaps the most dramatic example, but similar cases have been documented in many other cultures. The key to the longevity and accuracy of oral traditions appears to be their integration into the cultural life of the community. Stories that are told regularly, that are connected to specific places and landmarks, that are reinforced by ritual and ceremony, and that are regarded as important by the community are far more likely to be accurately transmitted than stories that are treated as mere entertainment. The Lyonesse legend, with its deep connections to the landscape of Cornwall and Scilly, its association with prominent local families like the Trevelyans, and its integration into the broader cultural identity of the Cornish people, has all the characteristics of a tradition that would be carefully preserved and faithfully transmitted. The role of landscape in preserving oral tradition is particularly important in the case of Lyonesse. The physical evidence of the drowned land, the submerged forests, the eroding cliffs, the archaeological remains beneath the waves, served as a constant, visible reminder of the truth behind the legend. Each generation could see for itself that the land had once been larger, that the sea had taken territory that had once been dry ground. This physical evidence acted as an anchor for the oral tradition, preventing it from drifting too far from reality and ensuring that the core message of the legend, that the sea had taken a land, was preserved even as the specific details changed over time. The integration of the Lyonesse legend with the Arthurian romances in the medieval period represents a crucial moment in the transmission of the tradition. Before this integration, the legend existed as a local Cornish tradition, transmitted orally within the communities of Cornwall and Scilly. After the integration, the legend became part of one of the most widely known and widely read literary traditions in Europe, ensuring its preservation in written form and its dissemination to audiences far beyond Cornwall. This transition from oral to written transmission was not unique to the Lyonesse legend. Many of the great legends and myths of European culture underwent a similar transition during the medieval period, as the oral traditions of the Celtic, Germanic, and other cultures were captured in writing by monastic scribes, courtly poets, and chronicle historians. The Arthurian legends themselves are a prime example of this process, drawing on centuries of oral tradition in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, before being given their definitive literary form by writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien de Troyes, and Thomas Malory. The transition from oral to written transmission both preserved and transformed the Lyonesse legend. It preserved the legend by fixing it in a form that could survive indefinitely, immune to the vagaries of memory and the risks of oral transmission. But it also transformed the legend by embedding it in a literary context, the Arthurian romances that imposed its own conventions, themes, and aesthetic values on the story. The Lyonesse of the romances is not quite the same as the Lyonesse of Cornish oral tradition. It is more literary, more courtly, more connected to the world of knights and kings. But beneath the literary surface, the essential Cornish story, the story of a land lost to the sea, remains intact. Chapter 24, Comparisons with Real Historical Floods. While the Lyonesse legend describes a single, sudden catastrophe, we know from other historical events that sudden, devastating floods are not merely the stuff of legend. Throughout history, there have been documented instances of catastrophic flooding that have destroyed communities, reshaped coastlines, and left lasting marks on the cultures that experienced them. Examining some of these real historical floods can help us to understand the kind of events that might have contributed to the Lyonesse legend. The most relevant examples come from the coasts of the North Sea, where the low-lying coastline has been particularly vulnerable to storm surges and flooding. The great floods of the medieval period in the Netherlands and northern Germany are among the most devastating natural disasters in European history, and they provide chilling illustrations of the destructive power of the sea. The St. Lucia's flood of 1287 struck the coast of the Netherlands with devastating force, killing an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people and permanently flooding large areas of formerly inhabited land. The flood was caused by a powerful storm surge that overwhelmed the sea defenses and inundated the low-lying polders, drowning entire communities and creating new inlets and channels where there had previously been dry land. The Zuider Zee, the large inland sea that would dominate the geography of the Netherlands for centuries, was greatly enlarged by this and subsequent floods. Even more devastating was the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421, which struck the coast of Holland and Zeeland, killing an estimated 10,000 people and flooding an area of several hundred square kilometers. The flooded area, known as the Biesbosch, remained permanently submerged and became a wetland wilderness that persists to this day. Contemporary accounts of the St. Elizabeth's flood describe scenes of horror, villages swallowed by the waves, churches collapsing into the water, people clinging to rooftops and trees as the flood swept over them. These historical floods share many features with the Lyonesse legend. They describe sudden catastrophic events in which the sea overwhelms the land, destroying communities and permanently altering the coastline. They describe the helplessness of the inhabitants in the face of the flood, the inability to escape, the total destruction of everything they had built. And they describe the lasting impact of the flood on the landscape, creating areas of permanent submergence where there had previously been inhabited land. The key difference is that these historical floods are documented in contemporary written records with specific dates, locations, and casualty figures. The Lyonesse legend, by contrast, is preserved in oral tradition and literary romance, without the specific historical detail that would allow us to identify a particular event. This does not mean that the Lyonesse legend is not based on a real event. It may well be, but it does mean that we cannot identify that event with the precision that is possible for the medieval floods of the Netherlands. Another significant comparison comes from more recent history. The Great North Sea Flood of 1953 struck the coasts of the Netherlands, Belgium, and eastern England on the night of January 31 to February 1, killing over 2,000 people and causing widespread destruction. In the Netherlands alone, nearly 2,000 people died, and large areas of the country were flooded. The disaster prompted the construction of the Delta Works, one of the greatest engineering projects of the 20th century, designed to protect the Netherlands from future flooding. The 1953 flood is within living memory, and the accounts of survivors provide a vivid and terrifying picture of what it is like to experience a catastrophic coastal flood. People were woken in the middle of the night by the sound of water rushing into their homes. They fled to upper floors, to rooftops, to the highest ground they could find. Some were rescued by boats, others were trapped by the rising water and drowned. The speed and power of the flood were overwhelming, and those who survived described the experience in terms that echo the Lyonesse legend, the sense of a world being swept away, of everything familiar being destroyed in a matter of hours. These real historical floods help us to understand the kind of events that might lie behind the Lyonesse legend. We know that catastrophic coastal flooding has occurred repeatedly throughout history, and we know that such flooding can cause sudden, dramatic, and permanent changes to the coastline. We also know that the Cornwall and Scilly area, with its exposure to Atlantic storms and its history of long-term sea level rise, would have been vulnerable to exactly this kind of event. It is entirely plausible that a major storm surge, striking the coast at a time when the land was already vulnerable due to long-term sea level rise, could have caused a sudden and dramatic loss of land in the Cornwall and Scilly area. Such an event would have been experienced by the local population as a catastrophe of the first order, a disaster that destroyed homes, drowned livestock, killed people, and permanently altered the landscape. And such an event would have been remembered, told and retold, elaborated and mythologized, until it became the legend of Lyonesse. Chapter 25, The Bells Beneath the Waves. Of all the images associated with the Lyonesse legend, none is more haunting or more evocative than the sound of church bells ringing beneath the sea. This motif, the idea that the bells of the drowned churches can still be heard tolling in the deep, their sound carried to the surface on calm days and quiet evenings, is one of the most enduring and emotionally powerful elements of the legend, and it deserves closer examination. The motif of the underwater bells is not unique to the Lyonesse legend. It appears in drowned land legends throughout the British Isles and beyond, in the story of Cantre'r, Gwaelod in Wales, in the legend of the city of Wise in Brittany, in the tale of Dunwich on the Suffolk coast. In each case, the bells serve the same symbolic function. They are the voice of the drowned land, its last communication with the living world, a reminder that what lies beneath the waves was once a place of human activity and human devotion. The bells also serve a deeper, more spiritual function. In Christian tradition, church bells are more than mere instruments of timekeeping or community communication. They are sacred objects, blessed and consecrated by the Church, and their sound is understood to have spiritual power, the power to call the faithful to prayer, to drive away evil spirits, to celebrate joy and mourn sorrow. The idea that the bells of the drowned churches continue to ring beneath the sea suggests that the spiritual life of the lost community continues, even after the physical community has been destroyed. The bells are a symbol of persistence, of the refusal of the human spirit to be silenced even by the overwhelming power of the sea. From a practical standpoint, the motif of the underwater bells may have its origins in the real sounds that can be heard in the marine environment. The sea is not a silent place. The movement of water over rocks, the grinding of sand and gravel, the vibration of underwater structures in the current, all of these produce sounds that can be transmitted through the water and under certain conditions heard at the surface. Fishermen and sailors working in the waters over the drowned land may have heard sounds that they interpreted as bells ringing, sounds that, filtered through the expectations created by the legend, seem to confirm the story of the sunken churches. There is also a psychological dimension to the motif. The human brain is remarkably adept at finding patterns and meaning in ambiguous sensory information, a tendency known as pareidolia. When people expect to hear bells, they are more likely to interpret ambiguous sounds as bell-like. The power of suggestion, combined with the atmospheric conditions of a calm sea and the emotional weight of the Lyonesse legend, could easily lead someone to hear the tolling of submerged bells in the natural sounds of the ocean. But whether or not the underwater bells are physically real is, in a sense, beside the point. Their power lies not in their physical reality, but in their symbolic meaning. The bells of Lyonesse represent the voice of the past calling to the present, the insistence of the dead that they be remembered, the refusal of a lost world to be entirely forgotten. They are a metaphor for memory itself, for the way that the past continues to resonate in the present, like a bell whose vibrations never quite die away. The image of the underwater bells has been used by many writers and artists to express this idea of the persistence of memory. Walter de la Mare's poem Sunk Lyonesse, which we discussed in Part 1, makes powerful use of the bell motif, imagining the drowned churches where water lost dark wood lost stirs and the toll of bells goes wanly round. The image of bells tolling in the underwater darkness, heard by no human ear but ringing nonetheless, is one of the most evocative in all English poetry, and it captures the essential mystery and melancholy of the Lyonesse legend with extraordinary precision. Chapter 26, Lyonesse in the 21st century. As we move further into the 21st century, the legend of Lyonesse is finding new audiences and new meanings. The convergence of several contemporary trends, the growing public awareness of climate change and sea level rise, the increasing interest in underwater archaeology and submerged landscapes, the revival of Celtic culture and identity, and the enduring popularity of fantasy literature and Arthurian legends, has created a cultural environment in which the Lyonesse legend is more relevant and more resonant than ever before. The scientific study of the drowned landscape between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly continues to advance, driven by new technologies and new research questions. Projects such as the Lyonesse Project, a multidisciplinary research initiative that brings together archaeologists, geologists, geographers, and environmental scientists, are using state-of-the-art techniques to map and study the submerged landscape in unprecedented detail. The project's work has revealed new evidence of human habitation on the drowned land and has provided fresh insights into the timing and mechanisms of submergence. The Lyonesse Project has been particularly notable for its use of Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, to create detailed digital models of the drowned landscape. These models integrate data from multiple sources, bathymetric surveys, geological cores, archaeological records, historical maps, to create comprehensive, three-dimensional reconstructions of the landscape at different periods in the past. The models allow researchers to visualize what the area between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly looked like at different stages of the submergence process, providing a powerful tool for understanding the history of the drowned land and communicating that history to the public. The public engagement dimension of the Lyonesse Project and similar initiatives is an important part of their work. Researchers have made a deliberate effort to communicate their findings to a broad audience, using exhibitions, public lectures, media appearances, and online resources to share the story of the drowned land with people who might never visit a scientific laboratory or read an academic journal. This engagement has been enthusiastically received, confirming the enduring public fascination with the Lyonesse legend and the strong desire to know more about the real history behind the myth. Tourism has also been affected by the growing interest in Lyonesse. The Isles of Scilly, already a popular tourist destination, have seen increased interest from visitors drawn by the legend of the drowned land. Guided walks on the inter-island flats at low tide, pointing out the submerged walls and other archaeological features, have become a popular attraction, and the island's museums have developed exhibitions that tell the story of the drowned landscape and its relationship to the Lyonesse legend. The environmental implications of the Lyonesse story have also gained prominence in the 21st century. As the reality of climate change has become increasingly difficult to deny, the story of a land drowned by rising seas has acquired a new urgency. Environmental organizations have used the Lyonesse legend as a powerful communication tool, invoking the story of the drowned kingdom to illustrate the potential consequences of unchecked climate change and sea level rise. The legend provides a vivid, emotionally compelling narrative that can cut through the abstraction of scientific data and make the threat of sea level rise feel real and immediate. The Cornish cultural revival has also contributed to the renewed interest in Lyonesse. The revival of the Cornish language, the celebration of Cornish identity, and the growing recognition of Cornwall's distinctive cultural heritage have all created a context in which the Lyonesse legend is valued and celebrated as an important part of the Cornish story. Festivals, cultural events, and educational programs in Cornwall regularly feature the Lyonesse legend, and it has become a symbol of Cornish identity and resilience in the face of change. Chapter 27, What Lies Beneath, the Future of Exploration. The exploration of the drowned landscape of Lyonesse is far from complete. Despite the remarkable advances of recent decades, much of the seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly remains unsurveyed or only partially surveyed, and the potential for new discoveries is enormous. The future of Lyonesse research lies in the continued development and application of new technologies, the integration of different types of evidence, and the expansion of research into areas that have so far been little explored. One of the most promising areas for future research is the use of autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to survey the seabed in areas that are too deep or too hazardous for divers. AUVs are unmanned, robotic submersibles that can be programmed to follow predetermined routes across the seabed, collecting data as they go. Equipped with sonar, cameras, and other sensors, AUVs can survey large areas of the seabed quickly and efficiently, producing detailed maps and images that would be impossible to obtain by any other means. Another promising technology is environmental DNA, or eDNA, analysis. This technique involves extracting DNA from sediment samples and using it to identify the organisms that were present when the sediment was deposited. Applied to cores from the seabed between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, eDNA analysis could reveal what plants and animals were living on the now drowned land, providing detailed information about the environment that existed before the submergence. It could even potentially detect the presence of human DNA, providing direct evidence of human habitation on the drowned land. The integration of different types of evidence, geological, archaeological, historical, cartographic, and folkloric, is another key direction for future research. The story of Lyonesse is a story that cannot be told by any single discipline alone. It requires the combined expertise of geologists, archaeologists, historians, folklorists, linguists, and many other specialists, each bringing their own knowledge and perspective to the problem. The most productive research in this field has been multidisciplinary, drawing on the strengths of different disciplines to create a richer, more comprehensive understanding of the drowned landscape and the legend it inspired. The deeper waters between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly remain largely unexplored, and they represent the greatest opportunity for new discoveries. The shallower waters around the islands have been relatively well studied, but the deeper areas further offshore, the areas that would have been the heartland of the drowned landscape, are much less well known. As technology advances and as the resources available for underwater research increase, these deeper areas will become accessible for the first time, and the discoveries that await there may be truly transformative. There is also a growing recognition of the need to protect and preserve the submerged archaeological heritage of the Lyonesse area. The archaeological remains on the seabed are fragile and vulnerable, subject to ongoing erosion by tides and currents, damage by fishing gear and anchors, and the effects of climate change and rising sea levels. Without active protection and management, many of these remains will be lost before they can be properly documented and studied. In the United Kingdom, the legal framework for protecting underwater archaeological heritage has been strengthened in recent years, with the designation of protected wreck sites and the establishment of marine conservation zones. But much more needs to be done to ensure that the submerged heritage of the Lyonesse area is adequately protected, and that future generations will have the opportunity to study and appreciate this remarkable archaeological resource. Chapter 28, The Philosophy of Lost Worlds, The Legend of Lyonesse, invites us to reflect on some of the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to lose a world? What does it mean to remember a world that no longer exists? And what does the human fascination with lost worlds tell us about ourselves? The idea of a lost world has a powerful hold on the human imagination. From Plato's Atlantis to the mythical El Dorado, from the biblical Garden of Eden to the Celtic otherworld, human cultures have always been drawn to the idea of a place that once existed but can no longer be reached, a place of perfection, abundance, or beauty that has been taken away by the forces of nature, the passage of time, or the intervention of the gods. This fascination with lost worlds is more than mere nostalgia. It reflects a fundamental aspect of the human condition, the awareness that time passes, that things change, and that nothing lasts forever. The lost world is a symbol of everything that is transient in human experience. Youth, love, innocence, homeland, and the longing for the lost world is, at its deepest level, a longing for a return to a state of wholeness and harmony that we sense we have lost. The Lyonesse legend expresses this longing with particular poignancy. The drowned kingdom is not a distant, abstract paradise. It is a specific, local landscape, intimately connected to the real landscape of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. The people who told the story of Lyonesse were not dreaming of a golden age in a far-off land. They were mourning a real loss, the loss of fields they had farmed, shores they had walked, places they had called home. The Lyonesse legend is not an escape from reality. It is a confrontation with reality, with the hard, painful fact that the world is changing and that some of what we love will be taken away. This confrontation with loss is, paradoxically, also a source of meaning and value. The things we value most are often the things we are most afraid of losing, and the act of remembering what has been lost, of keeping it alive in story and song, in art and imagination, is itself an act of affirmation, a declaration that what was lost was worth remembering, that it mattered, that it had value. The bells ringing beneath the waves of Lyonesse are, in this sense, a symbol of the human refusal to forget. They are the voice of memory, calling across the centuries, insisting that the drowned world be remembered, that the dead be honored, that the past be acknowledged as part of the present. As long as the bells ring, as long as the stories are told, the lost world of Lyonesse is not entirely gone. It survives in the only medium that is truly immortal, the human imagination. Chapter 29, A Warning from the Deep. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration of Lyonesse, we must return to the question that has grown steadily more urgent throughout this documentary, the question of what the legend of Lyonesse means for the future. We are living in a time of rising seas. The same geological process that drowned the land between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, the melting of ice, the expansion of warming water, the slow but relentless advance of the ocean is occurring again, this time accelerated by human activity. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are losing mass at an increasing rate. Glaciers around the world are retreating. Sea levels are rising, and the rate of rise is accelerating. The consequences of this rise are already being felt. Low-lying coastal areas around the world are experiencing increased flooding, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies, and the erosion of beaches and wetlands. Small island nations are losing land to the sea, and their populations are beginning to plan for a future in which their homelands may no longer exist. In the wealthier nations, the costs of coastal defense and flood management are rising, and difficult decisions are being made about which areas to protect and which to surrender to the sea. In this context, the legend of Lyonesse is more than a historical curiosity. It is a warning, a message from the past about what happens when the sea advances and the land retreats. The people of Lyonesse could not stop the sea. They could not build defenses strong enough or retreat fast enough. All they could do was remember and hope that their memory would serve as a lesson for those who came after. We are the ones who came after. We are the inheritors of the Lyonesse legend, and we are facing the same challenge that the people of Lyonesse faced, the challenge of living on a coast that is being reshaped by forces we cannot fully control. The difference is that we understand the science behind the change. We know why the seas are rising, and we know what we can do to slow the rise. The question is whether we will act on that knowledge, whether we will take the steps necessary to protect our coasts, our communities, and our way of life, or whether we will, like the people of Lyonesse, wake up one day to find that the sea has taken what we thought was ours. The legend of Lyonesse does not offer us a solution. It offers us a story about loss and survival, about the power of the sea and the persistence of memory, about the things we value and the things we are afraid of losing. It is a story that has been told for 1,000 years, and it will continue to be told for as long as there are people who live by the sea and who understand what it means to be at the mercy of the waves. The lesson of Lyonesse is simple and profound. The sea does not care about our plans, our ambitions, or our dreams. It does not respect our boundaries, our property lines, or our sense of entitlement. It obeys only the laws of physics, the laws of temperature and pressure, of ice and water, of gravity and tide. And if we do not pay attention to these laws, if we do not take them seriously, we may find ourselves in the same situation as the people of Lyonesse, watching helplessly as the world we built disappears beneath the waves. Chapter 30. The Eternal Shore. We began this documentary on the cliffs at Land's End, looking westward across the Atlantic toward the distant Isles of Scilly. We ended in the same place on the same cliffs, looking at the same sea, but we see it differently now. We see it with eyes that have been opened by science and enriched by legend, by archaeology and poetry, by the hard facts of geology and the soft truths of folklore. The sea before us is not just an expanse of water. It is a landscape, a drowned landscape, hiding beneath its surface the remnants of a world that was once as real and as alive as the world we inhabit today. Beneath these waves lie the stumps of ancient forests, the foundations of stone walls, the traces of paths that were once walked by people who had no idea that their world was destined to disappear. Somewhere down there in the darkness and the silence lie the last physical traces of the kingdom of Lyonesse. But Lyonesse is not only down there. It is also up here in the stories we tell, in the poems we write, in the songs we sing. It is in the coat of arms of the Trevelyan family, with its horse rising from the waves. It is in the pages of Malory and Tennyson, in the music of Wagner and the paintings of Burne-Jones. It is in the scientific papers and survey reports that are slowly, painstakingly reconstructing the drowned landscape from the evidence of sonar and sediment cores. It is in the cultural identity of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, in the sense of connection to a past that extends beyond the visible world into the realm of memory and imagination. Lyonesse is, in the end, a story about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, a relationship that is sometimes harmonious and sometimes destructive, sometimes gentle and sometimes violent, but but always, always changing. The people of Lyonesse lived in a world that was changing around them, and they responded to that change in the most profoundly human way possible. They told stories about it. They told stories about what had been lost, and in telling those stories, they ensured that what had been lost would never be entirely forgotten. We are living in a world that is changing around us, too, changing more rapidly and more dramatically than at any time in human history. The challenges we face, climate change, sea level rise, environmental degradation, the loss of biodiversity, are enormous and unprecedented. But the Lyonesse legend reminds us that we are not the first people to face the loss of our world, and it suggests that the most important thing we can do, even in the face of overwhelming change, is to remember what was, to understand what is, and to imagine what might be. The bells still ring beneath the waves. They have been ringing for 1,000 years, and they will ring for 1,000 more. They ring for Lyonesse, for the lost kingdom and its lost people, for the fields and forests and churches and homes that now lie in the silence of the deep. But they ring for us too, for all of us who live on the edge of the water, who know the power of the sea, and who understand in our bones that the shore is not a boundary but a conversation, an eternal, ongoing conversation between the land and the sea, between the past and the present, between what is and what was and what will be. Listen, can you hear them? The bells of Lyonesse ringing in the deep. They are ringing for you. The land remembers, the sea remembers. And as long as we tell the story, as long as we listen for the bells, as long as we look out from the cliffs at Land's End toward the far, faint islands on the horizon, Lyonesse will never truly be lost. Some lands sink beneath the waves, some rise again in story. This is the story of Lyonesse. It was here, it is here still, and it will be here in the depths of the ocean, in the pages of books, in the hearts of all who hear its name forever. The waves break upon the shore, the tide rises. The tide falls, and beneath the gray Atlantic waters, the kingdom of Lyonesse sleeps on, dreaming of the day when the waters will recede, the bells will ring once more in the open air, and the lost land will rise, shining and new from the embrace of the eternal sea. Until that day, if that day ever comes, we have the legend, we have the science, we have the memory, and we have the bells, always the bells.